What we need from you guys is to please put your name and first name and last name into the chat. We're going to use that as our sign-in sheet. So we'll remind you guys throughout, but if you, we want to make sure we have everybody's name in there that is present. And again, my name's Alicia Chico, and we also have Jamie Motor. We'll be doing your training today. You know, this is 4 hours, so we hope that you guys will be as interactive as you want to be. If we want you to get out of this training, you know, what you need. So if you have questions, please put that in the chat, excuse me, or unmute yourself. And, you know, we're happy to be interactive throughout the day. We will be taking a break after. We're going to see 2 videos today. So after the first video, we'll take probably a 15-minute break, if that's, depending on how you guys are doing. And I guess, is that all the housekeeping, James?
I think so.
Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. So just some expectations for the day. Keep yourself muted unless you have a question. Or if you want to put your question in the chat, either one. We talked about documenting attendance. Please put your full name. You don't have to put your building. They said they don't need your building, so ignore that. This training is going to be recorded. It will be open from today until September 20th. And so anyone that takes it will need to submit a quiz. And excuse me, I think it's only like a 7-question quiz. You guys don't have to do that because you are present here live.
Okay, we're ready to get started. All right. Good morning, everyone. As Alicia said, I'm Jamie Motor. Welcome back to the school year. I'm sure you have a few days under your belt already. Alicia and I are just getting back into the swing of things as well. As she said, you're here to fulfill your Act 71 requirement. A few years ago, Pennsylvania passed Act 71, requiring that all educators in grades 6 through 12 are required to receive 4 hours of suicide prevention every 5 years. The recommendation is that all educators, not just the 6 through 12 grades, but that all educators receive it, because you know, you never know when you're going to run into a student who may be experiencing some of these suicidal thoughts or behaviors. Any age is certainly, we've seen all ages be affected by this. So I'm glad that they've opened it up to more than just 6 through 12 here. And that is the recommendation of the law, as I said. The other recommendation in the law, again, not a requirement, but another recommendation is that you provide some sort of suicide education to your students. And we will show you a video today that you can share. We can share with you if you choose to do so. Being that we're virtual today, we're not going to go over the whole curriculum as to what you can use, but this program actually comes with a student curriculum as well. So if that's something that you feel interested in and would like to implement in your district, we can certainly assist you in doing so. We have an outline, we make it pretty easy, pretty user-friendly. So that's something you can reach out to us afterwards. We'll provide our contact information, or your administrators have it already. So we're glad to help you with that. The program that we're going to be participating in today is the More Than Sad program, put out by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They are obviously a national organization that does a variety of things. They do a lot of prevention work for adolescents, a lot of prevention for all ages, actually. They have a college age program as well. They do a lot of support for survivors of suicide. There's a walk for suicide survivors. And there's also a lot of fundraising that they do. You may see their name out there doing some fundraising, and they do that to fund their research. They do a lot of research in the field of suicide prevention, which is really an underserved area. You'll hear Alicia and I today multiple times liken suicide or liken mental illness to physical illness, because I think there's not enough of that. There's this perception that someone who has a mental illness is choosing to feel that way, and that it's not just a sickness of their brain, which in fact it is. And you know, there's no stigma for people who have heart disease. There's no stigma for people who have diabetes or other physical health impairments. But for some reason, there's a stigma surrounding mental illness, which is simply a disease of the brain, just like any other organ of your body. And so when we talk about research, you'll see the huge difference. The amount of scientific funding per death for diabetes is about $40,000 per death of someone who dies from diabetes. That's how much money is funneled into research and prevention and things like that. For suicide, the amount of scientific funding per death is about $1,400. So there's a huge disparity there. And again, I think that just is a way to kind of frame our minds today and realize what a huge hill we have to climb in regard to overcoming this obstacle, but also that we can certainly make a difference in that, and that there have been some changes in regard to eliminating some of that stigma, I think. Especially the more celebrities come out and talk about, you know, how they're feeling. I think that's a huge thing that eliminates some barriers and eliminates some of that stigma, because it's easier for people to understand when somebody comes out and says, you know, that they're feeling that way, that, you know, it could be okay for them to feel that way too. So the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has the goal of decreasing suicide 20% by the year 2025. And we'll talk about a lot of statistics and stuff moving forward. And then we'll talk about how you can help your students to prevent having suicidal ideation or prevent having suicidal behaviors. And as Alicia said, just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask. You know, we know it's the beginning of the school year and you're all very busy. And so the worst thing for us would be if you felt like you wasted your time this morning. So please let us know if there's something that you need to discuss or would like to know about. We're happy to address it. Okay, so we're going to get started with a little test your knowledge here. And so again, not a test, no test anxiety here, but we're going to go over a couple of questions that we think will be helpful in, again, getting all of our minds sort of on the right track. So if you want to just, you know, type in the chat or, you know, say it out loud, however you want to do it, maybe typing in the chat would be a good way to do it. Which of the following best describes gender differences in youth suicide behavior? Do we think that A, boys make more suicide attempts, but girls are more likely to die by suicide? B, girls make more suicide attempts, but boys are more likely to die by suicide? C, boys and girls are equally likely to attempt suicide, but boys are more likely to die by suicide? Or D, boys and girls are equally likely to attempt suicide, but girls are more likely to die by suicide? Any thoughts there? You can put it in the chat for us.
So far, a lot of B's, couple C's, couple A's, but looks like it's mostly between A, B, and C.
Okay. Still see some coming in there. Okay, good. Well, thank you for participating. The answer is B. Girls make more suicide attempts, but boys are more likely to die by suicide. When we get to the statistics, we'll talk more about that in detail as to why that is the case, but we know that although girls are making more attempts, boys are more likely to be those that die by suicide. Okay. Number 2, the racial and ethnic groups having the highest rates of youth suicide are A, Black and Hispanic, B, White and Asian, C, American Indian and Alaskan Native, or D, White and Hispanic. I think we're seeing a wide variety there. Okay, thank you. The answer actually is C. The American Indian and Alaskan Native populations tend to have the highest rates of youth suicide. Has a lot to do with resources that are available to those populations. There's also some other factors that come into play there as well. Number 3, okay, most suicides are the fatal outcome of A, negative life events, B, inherited characteristics, C, vulnerability to stress, or D, mental health disorders.
Getting a lot of D's on this one.
A lot of D's, yeah.
Couple C's, couple A's.
Okay, thank you. So suicide is a very, very complex issue. There's never really just one factor. However, most people who die by suicide have an underlying mental health disorder. So it's D. 90% of people who die by suicide have an underlying untreated or undertreated mental health disorder. So D is the correct answer. Number 4, in order to be diagnosed, I can't read it because there's people chatting. Can you read it, Alicia? Is it depression? In order to be diagnosed with depression, symptoms need to last a minimum of A, 1 week, B, 2 weeks, C, 2 months, and I can't see D either on my view.
D is 6 months.
D is 6 months, thank you.
Lots of D's and C's.
Okay.
Saw an A, B, little bit of everything.
Okay. So the answer actually is B, 2 weeks. Thank you all for answering. So in order to be diagnosed with major depression, symptoms need to last a minimum of B, 2 weeks. The one thing about that is a diagnostic criteria. We don't want you guys to get too caught up in that. We're certainly not asking you to diagnose anybody. We know that educators are stretched so thin in the roles that they have or have so many expectations. The point of this training is not to ask you to do any more than you already do, to be therapists or to be counselors or be social workers, unless that's your job. I don't know if I have those people on here, counselors and social workers, maybe I do. Then that is your job. But if you're a teacher, your job is to teach the students, and your job certainly is not to diagnose them. Your job is to recognize the changes in your students when you see them and then report them to the proper person. But know that if those symptoms have not been going on for 2 weeks, it may not be diagnosed as major depression once you refer them. For the most part, though, by the time you see it, it's already been going on that amount of time. Number 5, which mental health disorder is more common in girls than in boys? A, depression, B, generalized anxiety disorder, C, eating disorders, or D, all of the above? Looks like mostly D's and C's. Okay, thank you guys. So for those of you who put D, all of the above is the correct answer. So depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and eating disorders are all more common in females. And as we said already in an earlier question, females have more suicide attempts. They have more of this underlying mental health disorders, of these specific ones at least occurring in females. A portion of that is because they're also more likely to get diagnosed because they're more likely to seek help. Whereas males, don't have as much help-seeking behavior. Females tend to get diagnosed more often with these specific disorders, at least. Number 6, which of the following statements is true? A, most mental health disorders cause emotional but not behavioral changes. B, most teens with mental health disorders show observable changes in behavior. C, only a trained mental health professional can recognize signs of a mental disorder in teens. And D, parents are usually in a better position than teachers to notice signs of a mental health disorder in a teen. So I'm seeing lots of B's there. Okay, good. So B is the correct answer. The one that's true is that most teens with mental health disorders show observable changes in behavior. It may be very subtle, but there usually are some changes that we can pick up on. And that's what we're really watching for those changes in our students. Noticing things that they're doing differently, withdrawing or becoming more energetic, or, the extremes sort of is what we're looking for. And the one that parents are usually in a better position to recognize those, in fact, that's not the case. I mean, all those other ones are false. But that one in particular, especially in this day and age when, kids come home, they're on their devices, they have their headphones on, they're doing homework, maybe they're in their room, may come out for dinner, they may not. The parents actually oftentimes are not in a better position. It's teachers who are imposing demands on students and are seeing them in social situations that may have a better window into what actually is going on. So we certainly can look for those observable changes. And number 7, which of the following is associated with high rates of depression in gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender youth? A, rejection by parents, B, ostracism and bullying by peers, C, alcohol and drugs, or D, all of the above. Looks like lots of D's. The answers there. Okay, thanks for participating. The answer is D, all of the above. So the LGBTQ population tends to struggle with all of these things: more rejection by parents, some ostracism and bullying by peers, and an increased rate of alcohol and drug and substance abuse. And so all of those things can contribute to high rates of depression in the population. Number 8, a cluster of teen suicides in a particular community or area is most likely to be a result of A, high unemployment, B, lack of parental supervision, C, exposure to suicide or contagion, or D, all of the above.
Looks like a lot of C's and D's.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So the answer is actually C. The contagion effect is a very real one. There are things that we can do as the adults to eliminate that or to lessen it, but there's also things that we can do, never intentionally, of course, that can actually contribute to the contagion effect. And we'll talk about some of those things, the way we talk about things, or the language we use, the specifics that we discuss. All of those things can either contribute to or lessen the contagion effect. One of the biggest offenders of increasing contagion is usually the media. The media is often uneducated as to how to best handle a suicide in a community, and sometimes the things that they do can actually contribute to the contagion effect. Number 9, approximately what percent of depressed teens receive some form of treatment? A, 10%, B, 30%, C, 50%, or D, 80%? A wide variety here. Okay, so the real answer, the actual answer is B, about 30%. And again, we talk about depression and underlying mental health concerns as being one of the biggest contributors to suicide. And only, 1 in 3 students or 1 in 3 youth are getting treatment when they are experiencing it. And so to liken that back to physical health, think about only, 30% of people with heart disease getting treatment. The results would be fatal, right? Well, the results are fatal here too, and that's what we want people to understand. Okay, and finally, number 10, teachers can play a role in preventing suicide by A, referring at-risk students to the appropriate helping resource, B, helping students learn about mental health disorders, C, supporting programs in the school and community that reduce suicide risk, and D, all of the above. Okay, looks like a lot of D's. I see a few variety, but a lot of D's, and the answer is D, all of the above. Again, we're not asking you to do anything beyond what you're already doing, but just knowing where to refer your students when you see them, when you see those changes, helping them learn about mental health disorders. If you have the opportunity to do so, like I said, we could provide you with the curriculum, or if you have something you're already using, making sure you're providing the most up-to-date current information, then supporting programs that reduce suicide risk, like this one, like being here today, it's already the first step in doing so. So there's also some other things that we'll talk about that can help to keep students safe as the training progresses. Any questions about any of those so far? Feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. Okay, so a lot of those we will hit in more depth as we move forward, the sort of whys behind some of those. And now that you're all used to using the chat, again, feel free to ask any questions that you have. Just one more reminder, if you signed on a little late, to go ahead and put your name in there too, because we'll weed through all that and turn that in as sort of a sign-in sheet to your administrators. Okay, so getting into the meat of the training here. So first of all, we want to talk about our language, and we as the adults want to model safe language for our students, and definitely how we talk about suicide matters. The term committed suicide is something that is a habit that people have. I hear it on TV all the time. I hear it from professionals. It's a hard habit to break, but the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention recommends that we don't use the words committed suicide. When we say committed something, it labels it as criminal, or it labels it as sinful. You commit murder, you commit burglary. They don't want to give suicide the same connotation. And so they're asking people to replace it with died by suicide, ended his or her life, killed himself or herself. I know that's more direct, but again, that's what they're asking people to replace it with. What I've kind of turned to is completed suicide. It's been an easy sort of switch. But again, we recognize it's a hard habit, but if you stop and think when you say it, completed suicide or died by suicide is a more appropriate way to frame it. The other thing they're asking people to avoid is saying a failed or a successful attempt. They had a successful suicide attempt. When we say those words like failed or successful, it makes it very goal oriented. We don't want to make it sound like an achievement or a lack of achievement if someone dies by suicide. And so the language that we use can really contribute to or help to lessen the stigma. And also it's one of those things that can help to lessen the contagion effect. Another one they don't have on here is that if you do, unfortunately, experience a suicide in your community, they ask that you don't talk about the methods of suicide. They know that if discussion of the methods can contribute to the contagion effect in the youth population. So our goals today, we certainly want you to understand the scope of youth suicide, and we're going to give you real data that's out there. Again, the media can often be misleading when it comes to suicide discussions. We're also going to give you the most current data that we have. Alicia and I spent time this summer updating this training with the most current information that's out there. Some of it is still a couple years old. A lot of it comes from the CDC, and you may have heard, the CDC has been doing some other things recently. So they may not have the most up-to-date. It's usually about 2 years behind anyway, by the time they study it and release it and things like that. So a lot of our most current data will be from like 2019, but we have incorporated that into this training. We want to identify the warning signs and risk factors for suicide in teens. Many of the warning signs we're going to discuss apply to all ages, but we're going to focus specifically on the youth warning signs today so that you're prepared to recognize them in your students. We're going to look at how to refer at-risk students. Knowing your school policy is so important. Knowing who it is you should refer them to if you believe they are experiencing suicidal ideations or suicidal behaviors. And our job is not to diagnose or treat. Again, it's just to recognize the signs and refer them. And we'll also get an overview of mental health diagnoses and mental health treatments. Again, so you know what signs that you are looking for and that you understand some of the treatments that your students may be undergoing if they are diagnosed with something. A few more key terms that we want to go over, just so you know what we are referring to when we discuss them today. Suicidal ideation is any thought of engaging in suicide-related behavior, whereas suicidal behaviors are any behaviors related to suicide, including preparatory acts. So things like searching for means or Google searches, methods, formulating a plan, And then even suicide attempts and death are considered suicidal behaviors. When we move from ideation to behaviors, we're moving from basically thoughts to actions there. Non-suicidal self-injury is self-injury with no intent to die. So you may have heard of students that are cutting. Cutting is not a suicidal behavior necessarily. It's basically redirecting of pain that is psychological to pain that is physical. So it's a coping mechanism that certainly indicates there's an underlying mental health problem. So it's something to be concerned about, but it doesn't necessarily mean they are suicidal. Definitely something we still want to intervene with. The people who did our training went so far as to say that if you have piercings, if you have tattoos, those are actually self-injuries. And certainly when you get your ears pierced, you know, your intent is not to die. So that'll be a non-suicidal self-injury. A suicide attempt is a non-fatal, self-directed, potentially injurious behavior with an intent to die. So the intent is the thing that makes the difference there. A suicide attempt may or may not result in an injury. Suicide attempts are opportunities for us to intervene. So it's important that we have an open line of communication with our families, that they are telling us if their child has attempted suicide in the past, so that we know that that's a student that we want to, you know, sort of keep an extra eye on. And then a suicide, again, is a death caused by self-directed injurious behavior with an intent to die. So that intent has to be there in order to be classified as a suicide. Looking at the scope of the problem, again, this data is recent, it's from 2019. And so the data will tell us that about 47,500 reported suicide deaths occurred overall in the US population in 2019. That's almost 14 suicides per 100,000 in the population. When we look at youth ages 10 to 24, we see there were 6,500 reported suicides in that year. So again, 13.6% of total suicides in the US are in this age group, the ages 10 to 24, which are the ages that we're often dealing with. That's about 10 suicides per 100,000 youth. And I think it's important to note that suicides are the second leading cause of death for youth ages 10 to 24. Accidents are actually the number one cause, followed closely by suicide. Keep in mind also that suicide deaths are based on a label by the medical examiner. So they're the ones that are determining the cause of death. So as we're talking about a lot of these statistics, be aware that they are vastly underreported because, again, the medical examiner has to be certain that there was that intent as part of it. Looking specifically at Pennsylvania, suicide overall is the 11th leading cause of death in Pennsylvania. Again, the second leading cause of death for the ages that we were discussing, although this is saying 10 to 34 as opposed to 10 to 24. In Pennsylvania, what you see though is that a lot of our communities up in the right corner there, 61.6% did not have enough mental health providers to serve residents. And we see that as a barrier, you know, that there are not enough mental health providers out there for all the population, but for youth in particular, it tends to be a huge barrier. 62.5% of firearm deaths were suicides, and 50% of suicides were by firearms. So again, that's another concern, the lethal means that people have access to. I always think it's interesting to note that 6 times as many people died by suicide in 2019 than in alcohol-related motor vehicle accidents. And when you think about the amount of media coverage and advertising and things that are done for prevention in regard to drinking and driving, you know, it's much more that you're seeing for suicide. When the reality is 6 times as many people are dying by suicide than by those driving under the influence situations. Pennsylvania ranks 37th in the nation in regard to suicide. Looking at suicide data in the United States, I already mentioned, you know, 47,500 Americans died by suicide, making it the 10th leading cause of death in the nation. Remember, it was 11th in Pennsylvania. That's second leading cause of death overall for the same ages that we talked about. About 12 million Americans have serious thoughts of suicide. Just remember that although that's a huge number, it's not healthy to have thoughts of suicide. That's why we want to intervene when we know our students are having ideations. And 54%, over half of Americans have been affected by suicide in some way. And again, just thinking about the ripple effect there. It's not just the person who dies by suicide. It's not just their family. it's their family's friends, their family's coworkers, it's teachers, it's their friends, their families. So the ripple effect is huge when someone attempts or dies by a suicide. In 2019, the suicide rate was 1.5 times higher for veterans. Veterans tend to be a particularly at-risk group. I know that may not apply to your students, but being aware that if you have students who have family members who have served in the military, they could be at risk for that sort of ripple effect as well. And just like in Pennsylvania, even higher, 73% of the United States did not have enough mental health providers to serve residents in 2020. So again, it's a problem, nationwide that we're experiencing with a lack of providers. When we look at US suicide rates across the lifespan, what you see here is that we see around 9 to 10 years is when we see the line sort of start to jump and to go up. It's highest actually in the middle ages. So the highest rates of suicide are in, like, you can see the mid 40s or so. The second highest is actually in the elderly population. But what the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention would like to do, and what Act 71 is hoping to do, is to intervene at those lower levels, those lower ages, and thereby bring the whole graph down. We can make a difference there, then we can make a difference, further out as well. And so the rate is still, fairly high for our youth that we're dealing with. And, again, when you see those, around 9, 10 years old, that kind of that hits you home, because at such a young age to be experiencing these suicide rates. When we look at by age group, what you see here is that there's an increase happening in the age group that we're concerned with, particularly in the 15 to 24-year-old age group. That's that bottom one there. So although their rates tend to be lower than some of the other ages, you see that starting in 2014 or so, there's been an increase. That increase has continued. This graph ends at 2016, but the most recent data shows that the increase has continued. The increase is very alarming to people in this field and very concerning. There's some research happening as to why that's the case. You see that some other groups are also increasing, in particular the 65 to 74-year-olds. Others are, going down, so the 45 to 54-year-olds. Some contributing factors for the youth could be contagion. It could be the ability to see, people attempting suicide online. There's immediate access to information on everything, and so a Google search can very easily bring up, suicide methods and things like that. So it could be, the fact that they have access to information, all their devices, streaming videos, things like that. And so that could be almost a sort of contagion effect. It could also be there's an increased access to firearms in the home. So again, more access to those lethal means could be contributing to the increase. The other contributing factor could be more statistical, and that would be preferred, of course. It could be that there were more in the past too, but they were underreported, which would speak to hopefully a lessening of the stigma associated. Could also just be a better ability to determine suicide, through science and things like that. So it could be that it was underreported in the past. However, we know with everything that's going on now with the pandemic, the most recent research shows that in the last year and a half, in particular, suicide rates have increased due to so much happening with isolation, with lack of medical care because people aren't going to doctors because they were afraid of the virus, because of a variety of reasons: isolation, increased mental health concerns, anxiety, and things like that. So we know that, again, although this graph ends at 2016, that increase has continued and it has gone up actually for all ages. When we look at youth suicide rates by gender, what you see is that around the ages of 10 to 14, the rates are fairly similar for males and females. Around 15 or 16, that's where we see young males begin dying at a much higher rate. We mentioned this in the quiz at the beginning, that females tend to have more, ideations and more attempts, but males are dying by suicide at a much greater rate, especially as we progress through the years there. When you look out around in their 20s, especially like 22 years of age, you can see a huge difference there. Does anybody have any idea of why that might be the case? You can put it in the chat or unmute. There's a couple of reasons. Anybody want to share why they think males are dying at a higher rate?
So they choose guns, expression with a question mark, which I think means they're not able to express as much.
Mhm.
Yes, that's what it means. Thank you.
Anyone else have any thoughts? Okay, another one. Okay.
Attention-seeking behavior is higher in girls. The method of suicide, expected to act, quote, like a man, methods, and they do not seek help. More lethal methods, the method, not as willing to seek help. Method is more lethal.
Okay. Okay.
Very
Thank you
good,
guys
thanks.
for participating. Yeah, I appreciate it. So you're all actually right. Males definitely tend to access more lethal means and turn to more lethal means. And that definitely is one of the biggest contributing factors as to why they are dying by suicide more often. Males also tend to exhibit more impulsivity. So they're more impulsive and quickly turn to suicide as opposed to, problem solving and thinking things through. It takes longer for their frontal lobes to develop. Males tend to, take into their mid 20s or late 20s for their frontal lobes to develop. Girls tend to be a little earlier than that. So the frontal lobe, controls decision making and impulsivity and judgment and things like that. So that's another contributing factor. And many of you also hit the nail on the head that there are gender biases on acceptability of seeking help. So as opposed to seeking help as a sign of, intelligence and a sign of, meeting your needs and strength, males tend to see help seeking as a sign of weakness. And so they often don't feel it's acceptable to seek help, talk to their friends, talk to their families, to turn to professionals, things like that. And so again, that's one of the big stigmas that we're trying to eliminate. Nobody would think seeking treatment for a heart disease was a sign of weakness, and so people shouldn't think seeking treatment for a mental illness, which is a disease of the brain, is a sign of weakness either. So it's a mountain that we have to climb, sort of. And again, we addressed race and ethnicity in our quiz. When you look at this here, that gives you more statistics in regard to it. We did say that the American Indian and Alaskan Natives tend to have the highest rate over whites, Asian Pacific Islanders, Black, and Hispanics. Excuse me. There's a real lack of resources in those populations, specifically the American Indian and Alaskan Natives. There's high rates of substance abuse. We were actually educated by someone who said that not only is there a lack of resources on American Indian reservations, but also that when they seek help off of the reservation, they oftentimes can be turned away. They don't have the proper insurance or the proper payments or things like that. So they may be turned away. They're also, going back to the stigma, there's a stigma in regard to help seeking, that they should be able to handle things themselves. And so that's another reason we see such a high rate there. Keep in mind that the national average is about 9.5 per 100,000. So both the American Indian and Alaskan Native and the white population are above the national average in regard to that. So the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey is done every 2 years on high school students, on kids in grades 9 through 12. This is data from 2017. That's the most recent that's out there. When they last did it, they found that 17.2% of high school students who completed the survey reported having seriously considered attempting suicide in the previous years. They were having thoughts of it. They were having a serious consideration. About 13.5 reported having made a plan for suicide, so it moved from thoughts to planning to behaviors. And then about 7.5 reported having actually attempted suicide in the last year. And again, that was in 2017. It's important to take note of suicide attempts because for every suicide, it's estimated that there are 25 attempts. No complete count is kept because many go unreported or untreated. Again, it has to do with that stigma. People don't want it to be counted as a suicide. They don't want their child to receive treatment. They don't want to tell someone that they themselves had attempted suicide when they go to the hospital. They classify it as an accident, or they're just not sure. The doctors aren't sure. For youth suicide attempts, it's even significantly higher. For every suicide attempt in youth, 100 to 200 make an attempt. So it's an extreme difference. In 2015, over 182,000 youth, that's the ages of 10 to 24, were hospitalized for self-inflicted injuries. So, the attempts are only classified if the person goes to the hospital or seeks medical treatment. There's so many that don't do that. And even those that do, again, especially the families oftentimes don't want it classified as a suicide attempt. And that's, again, a barrier that we're trying to overcome, because an attempt is an opportunity to intervene. If you know that your student has made an attempt, you know that that means they're at risk for future attempts. And so that's a student that you can be a little more vigilant about, and that you can really keep an eye on and watch for changes and things like that. Any idea, again, you can put this in the chat, get a little interaction here, as to why youth have so many more attempts, and yet, for every suicide, there's actually so many more attempts. Any idea why youth are more likely to survive their attempts?
That went too quick. I saw one. Extreme cry for help, not able to come up with a plan, hesitation. They don't know what they're doing, attention. They don't know how to do it as effectively, attention, not actually ready to die. They get scared.
Yeah, so you guys are on the right track. Thank you for participating. So, not knowing how to do it, not formulating a plan, they have less access to lethal means. And so, unless there's a gun in the home, they can't go out and purchase a firearm, right? Maybe they can't get the prescriptions for, certain drugs or things like that. And so, yes, less access to lethal means, more of a cry for help. They're not turning to lethal means as often, could definitely be one of the reasons. The other thing is, they're younger, they're healthier, so they're more likely to survive those attempts. Whereas, we saw the second highest population were the elderly. They're just not as healthy. Their bodies aren't as healthy. The other thing is they live with others, and they probably know that, and so whereas adults may live alone and nobody finds them to get them the medical help that they need, with youth, somebody is there in the house and finds them and gets them help or intervenes and stops them before it becomes lethal. So yes, lots of good thoughts there that you guys had. Thank you again for participating. Just trying to keep everybody awake here. So thank you. Looking specifically at more at-risk populations, we already mentioned the majority of all deaths by suicide are men. We know that women, however, attempt suicide 3 times more often than men. We mentioned in the quiz in the beginning that the LGBTQ population is at risk. And you see here that attempts are 2 to 6 times more frequent among youth who identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual than among heterosexual youth. And then based on a 2017 survey of high school students, 12.5% of Black female students reported attempting suicide. So that's, again, a population that we want to be particularly concerned about. When you compare that to other racial demographics, it's about 10.5% of Hispanic females and about 7% of white females. So the Black female students, again, tend to be attempting suicide at a higher rate than other racial demographics. So a group that you want to be concerned about. 70% of all suicide deaths are white males of any age. So something to keep in mind too. So a few years ago, Alicia and I worked with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention to incorporate some information into this training about our students who are in the special education population. It was glaringly lacking in this training, and I think that speaks to the fact that people underestimate students with special needs and overlook the fact that they can, in fact, be suicidal, have suicidal ideations, perform suicidal behaviors. And so we wanted to incorporate some information here that would address that specifically, because we think it's important that it's not an overlooked group. So 2 of the groups that we're going to talk a lot about today are those on the autism spectrum and those with intellectual disabilities. And when you look at the characteristics of those disabilities, you see that many of them are things that could become a risk factor for suicide. So the fact that those on the autism spectrum have difficulty with social interaction and communication. The restricted or stereotyped behavior could make it easy to overlook some of their behaviors that could, in fact, indicate that they are struggling with their mental health. With intellectual disabilities, that deficit in general mental abilities makes people believe that they couldn't formulate a plan or that they couldn't possibly attempt suicide. And again, we know that's not the case in this population. There's the impairment of adaptive functioning and the inability to meet standards of personal independence that again can become big risk factors for this population as well. When we look at some statistics surrounding children with autism, they are 28 times more likely to have had suicidal thoughts or attempts as compared to other groups. And there's been many studies done, but the one that we want to highlight showed that when you're looking at high functioning individuals on the autism spectrum, 66% presented self-reported suicidal ideation. So they were willing to report that they were experiencing suicidal thoughts. And 35% self-reported that they were making plans or had made attempts at suicide. So again, that's a large portion of the population. Approximately 70% of youth on the autism spectrum experience mental health issues. And 40 to 50% of adolescents on the autism spectrum meet the diagnostic criteria for 2 or more psychiatric conditions. And we know that the more comorbid conditions that you have, the more likely you are to be at risk for suicide because the more you have going on. When we look at students with learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities, certain youth subgroups, particularly those who are nonverbal, but actually even those that are just less academically adept, they manifest higher rates of depression. And we know depression is a leading cause of suicide. Youth with poor reading ability, also that's a risk factor because they are more likely to drop out of school, which takes away their social supports, which makes them more likely to experience suicidal ideations. And the rates of suicide risk factors, so those risk factors, those co-occurring things, are higher in those with intellectual disability. We do know that their suicide rates might be lower, but it's still not a group that we want to overlook. Although they may not be able to put their plan in action, they certainly are having thoughts of suicide at a high rate and maybe looking at some unique ways to attempt a suicide. Just a few other special needs that we wanted to highlight. Suicide rates are much higher among people with spinal cord injuries and with multiple sclerosis than the general population. And just as I said, the more comorbid conditions a person exhibits, the greater the risk for suicide. And again, we often see people having more than one, mental health concerns, substance abuse, physical disabilities, things like that. The more that sort of piles on, the more at risk they are. Suicide ideation is life-threatening and must be taken seriously every time. As I said, it is not healthy to think about suicide. Excuse me. You may have students who, use that as a go-to when they're stressed out. Oh, I just wish I could die, or I don't want to, I just like to kill myself, or something like that. The problem with that is you never know when they actually mean it. They are oftentimes seeking attention, but if they are willing to go to that length to say that they want to die to get attention, then we probably need to give them some attention. And we need to ask them if, in fact, they truly mean that. So it has to be taken seriously each time. Remembering that the child's brain is different. We talked a little bit about males' frontal lobes not developing, but just in general, children aren't developing their frontal lobes, so they experience more impulsivity. They experience a lack of judgment. They experience a lack of problem solving, so they're not able to see things through to the consequences. And so anytime a student says that, it's an opportunity to intervene. It's also an opportunity to educate them. If you have students that are using that as their go-to, educating them to use better language, asking them, do you really mean that? Because if you do, we're going to go get you help. There's a consequence when you say that. You end up getting help, which is a good thing. It's a good consequence if they mean it. But if they say that and they don't mean it, then educating them, on a better way to express themselves, better language to use, and expressing to them that contributes to, the stigma and contributes to the concern. Suicidal ideation is often communicated before an attempt. So there usually is some verbalization or some sign, at least, something that you can see. Outside of that communication, the ideation is often well hidden, as is the youth's actual level of distress. It's been found that young people can hide their level of distress much better than adults. So in that case, with the population that we are working with, the ideation may be more behavioral than verbal. They may not come out and say it. You may be able to notice some signs, some withdrawal and things like that that we'll discuss as we move forward. So we now are going to watch the first video that we have as part of the training. This video is to be shown to staff, to adults. This is not a video for the kids. Later in the training, we'll see a video that you can show to your students if you feel like this is something you would like to address. This video provides an overview of mental health conditions in teens. You'll see a lot of different things that can contribute to suicide risk. It will give you some behaviors to watch for that suggest a student may be at risk for suicide. There are real educators on here sharing their stories. And it shows what a teacher and other school personnel can do to help a student at risk if you feel you have one. Any questions while Alicia's pulling up the video? Feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. Okay.
You
I'm
may
gonna give a
ask
thumbs up if you
yourself
can hear.
why you should learn about the signs and symptoms of various mental disorders that indicate that a student may be suicidal. The answer is because, as a teacher, you have the unique opportunity to observe behavioral changes in your students that others may not notice. The teachers in this film will share their stories of referring students for help. We encourage you to familiarize yourself with your school's policies regarding student referrals. If you notice any of the symptoms outlined in this film in one of your students, speak to him or her as well as to the school counselor. By referring a student for evaluation, you are helping him or her to get the help that he or she needs. You may even save a life. "32,000 people in the U.S. die by suicide each year. It's the third leading cause of death for young people 10 to 19 years of age. There are many risk factors for suicide. However, over 90% of young people who die by suicide are suffering from a mental health problem. There are several mental disorders that put young people at risk for suicide, and these are major depression, bipolar disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, drug and alcohol abuse, and conduct disorder. Children who have a family history of mental disorders are at a greater risk for suicide.
Your teacher, she said you've been missing school. And when you do show up, you often seem unprepared. Lana, that's so unlike you. What's going on?
So one of the things that you're looking for if you have concern that a teenager may have major depression, there's a change in what the young person usually did. Those changes can be in various different areas of their life simultaneously. So one area would be how they're doing in school. You may actually see a change in their grades. A child that had been getting A's or B's or C's are now getting a significant grade change of like D's and F's. You may also notice changes in how the teenager is interacting with their peers. So you may notice that they're not sitting with their usual group of friends at lunchtime that they normally would hang out with, or they seem to be isolating themselves more, choosing not to join in with the groups of kids to talk about things or doing after-school activities. The teenager may decide not to participate in a usual sport or an after-school activity that they had usually enjoyed.
There was a student that I had, she was very athletic. You know, she was involved in all the sports that we offered, basketball player, softball player, wanted to run track. And one day she just said that she wasn't interested in doing that anymore. And I asked her, you know, what's going on? This doesn't sound like you. This is not the girl that I know. You know, this is not my student. And the answer was kind of like, nothing, no, I don't want to talk about it. So what I did was I referred her to the guidance counselor. She, you know, started seeing the guidance counselor on a regular basis, and 3 or 4 months after, you know, me saying something to her initially, like I noticed that there's something wrong. She came to me and said, thank you for, saying something to me. And I asked her, is there anything you want to talk about? She said, no, it's nothing I want to talk about. I have some problems at home, but, thank you. And my response was, I just want you to know that I know you. You're my student, and, I've gotten to know you, and I'm concerned. That was a really, really good moment for me.
One of the things that can be confusing is that in school, a young person on the one hand could look more sad, depressed, unhappy, not participating in class. On the other hand, you could have a student who is looking very cranky and irritable and being very difficult and very oppositional. And you might not think that that is depression, but it could be, and it's just something to keep in mind. So there's some physical changes that can occur for a teenager suffering from depression. A teacher may notice a young person who's not eating their lunch. They may come with their lunch every day, and they actually don't even touch it. The other opposite can occur as well. Some young people, when they get depression, start overeating. They actually crave carbohydrates. They eat a lot more candy and junk food. Other types of physical symptoms, the young person may be complaining of feeling tired a lot of the time, having low energy, feeling like they can't pick themselves up and go. They may find it very hard to fall asleep at night, stay asleep, may find themselves waking up really early, or they're tossing and turning through the night, so they're not feeling rested when they get up in the morning. And when they come into school, they may actually have real deep dark circles on their eyes and really look really, exhausted. So another thing to be aware of is to really listen for children who have self-esteem issues. And one way you can notice that is by various comments that the teenager may make about themselves, such as, I'm not worth anything, I can't do anything right, I don't like myself. While you are working with young people and during the school year, they may be working on various projects, whether it's writing poems or doing artwork or writing short stories, to look for themes that seem very dark, sad, talking about life not worth living, a lot of themes about death, dying, people dying around them, feelings of hopelessness or worthlessness that comes through that writing.
I would see poetry or a free writing that would say, everybody sucks, I hate everything, why is the world so unfair, why am I treated this way, how can she go out with someone else, how can he treat me this way. Some of the words I would pay attention to would be I hate, anger. What is very important to track the behavior. What I do is I write down the observable behaviors of a student. If a student is depressed and does not get their work done, just keep a log of that. I write it down, I make a mental note, I just keep track of that, because if that behavior changes, that tells me that that student might have some sign of depression.
Personally, I have a rule of thumb. Anytime that behavior seems contrary to a pattern that you've been watching for longer than 2 to 3 weeks, then you ought to start thinking. You ought to start taking action. But in my case, I had looked at Will almost physically change. He's a tall, lanky kid, and he began to shrink. Everything retreated as though he were underwater, and it became so visible and such a visceral reaction that I thought, there is something wrong with my child.
There are chemicals in the brain that help the different parts of the brain communicate with each other. If the chemicals get out of balance, this communication can break down and lead to depression. Depressed brains show a decrease in serotonin transporter levels in specific areas of the brain. Medication works to reset the brain's chemistry and is generally used for 6 to 12 months.
As much as I know about this illness, it was very hard for me to come to terms with the fact that my son was depressed. He was getting ready for exams, and I found him. He was lying in his room, papers scattered all over the place, and he was in tears. And I said, what's going on? And he said, I just can't do this anymore. And suddenly it hit me that this child was depressed, that my son was depressed. We have a family history of depression. I suffer from depression myself. I should be sharper about this. And I said, sweetie, I think I know what is wrong here. I think you are depressed, and I know this. I know this illness. We will get you help. We will make sure that we do something about this. You do not have to feel this way.
So another disorder to be aware of that puts a teenager at heightened risk is bipolar disorder. This is a disorder that has two different, in a sense, mood states. One which is like major depression, where the young person has low energy, inability to get out of bed, get things done, poor concentration, may report being irritable, tired, not being able to do things as they used to. And that mood can shift and change to a period of time where they have an elevation of their mood. They feel extremely happy, very energized. They have a decreased need of sleep or no need for sleep at all. They actually may feel that their thoughts are racing. They're talking very fast. People around them may feel that they're not actually making sense. They also may change in the way that they dress. They may all of a sudden be dressing more provocatively than what was normal for them. They may actually show very poor decision-making ability. So they may, as an example, take their parents' car and take off with it without telling them, getting a speeding ticket, running red lights, going places where they're not supposed to go. They may engage in risky sexual behavior.
It was my first year teaching, and I was teaching 7th grade. I had several students who had been told, were the rambunctious 6th graders who were coming in, and I was supposed to look out for them. One of those students ended up, I realized, being very, very smart. He had days when he was extremely out of control, laughing at everything, running around the classroom, being, again, what many people would say, a 7th grade boy who was kind of just going through hormonal shifts. And it wasn't until the end of the year when there was an incident at a softball practice when someone did something extremely out of the ordinary, vandalizing the school. And when I did find out it was this student, I was immediately taken aback. And I called his mother, and she volunteered before I even told her about the incident that he had been diagnosed as bipolar. And it made me realize that so many of the things that I saw in my classroom and so many of the things that we see in our classrooms, we can't just label as typical behavior, because a student that is being a typical 7th grader might actually be dealing with something that's much more serious, such as having a bipolar disorder diagnosis.
Generalized anxiety disorder. This is a disorder where the young person is worrying about many things in multiple areas of their life. Now, we all have worries and we all have anxiety, but this is worry that's excessive to the average person's experience of worry. So, for example, you could have a student who is an A student or a B student who often does very well and appears to be doing very well, but who internally really feels that they're constantly worrying that they're going to fail, that they're not going to get it right. These are often young people who are perfectionistic. They're often doing well in multiple areas of their life. They may be the captain of a particular sports team. They may seem like they have lots of friends, but inside they're constantly very hard on themselves and feeling like they're not doing a good enough job.
Everyone thinks that I'm so perfect and that it all comes easy for me, but it doesn't. I worry about everything. I worry about school stuff. I worry about tests. I worry about games. It really does get me down.
So when you have a student who is worried in multiple areas of their lives, and this worry seems to be continuous and getting in their way and fully enjoying all the things that they're involved in, other symptoms that are related to this and help make this diagnosis are a series of physical symptoms. And they can have, from anywhere from 1 to 3 of these symptoms. They may be experiencing difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, or waking up earlier than they need to be. They may also feel very tired during the day. They may also feel that they're having trouble concentrating, and then also have a feeling of feeling tense all the time. So another illness that can put a teenager at risk for suicide is drug and alcohol abuse. One of the things that can happen is when a young person is suffering from many of the disorders that I've already discussed, is that they may actually utilize alcohol or drugs to help cope with the symptoms that they're experiencing. So a young person who's anxious and feels very uncomfortable in social situations may actually use alcohol to help relax themselves and try to cope with what's going on with them. A depressed teenager might think, geez, if I just smoked a little marijuana, maybe that way I'd feel a little bit better, even though we know that all these type of coping strategies are not going to work.
Yeah? That sounds like a good idea. Yes. Watch it, man.
Alcohol and drug dependence can actually lead a teenager to have decreased control over their thinking and their behaviors and actions, and they actually end up, unfortunately, making a poor decision, or in that moment of feeling so awful, actually making a suicide attempt. Another disorder that put teenagers at risk for suicide is conduct disorder. Teenagers who have this disorder are often not liked and very hard to reach. These are young people who may be involved with stealing, with getting into fights with their peers, with lying, with running away from home, not attending school. They can be physically aggressive and they can be sexually aggressive. They can often be considered the classroom bully. They use intimidation when they interact with other people. They can be very defiant and oppositional and can be very difficult to manage in the classroom.
You know, you find a lot in just the tone, their speaking tone, being all of a sudden, not so much being disrespectful of cursing at a teacher, but just the way they interact with each other and how they interact with you as an authority figure. You know, you can see very early on the signs of a student that starts to shift before it gets to the point that they're really, you know, in the abyss and they're trying to claw their way out. Because I really think that they want someone to see that and to sit down and, as I said before, listen. Okay, what's up? I will validate anything you're saying because I was a kid too, so I know that it hurts.
When a young person starts thinking that life's not worth living, they're better off dead than alive, they may actually make a suicide attempt. So young people are at an increased risk for suicide once they've had a suicide attempt in their life. They're also at increased risk if there's a family history of there being a suicide attempt or a completed suicide. There are situational factors that can heighten a teenager's risk for suicide, such as if there's a divorce in the family, a breakup with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, sexual or physical abuse at home, a very critical family situation, if there's a death of a loved one that was very close to the student. Bullying, and that can be face-to-face bullying or bullying that's experienced through the internet.
And those girls sent my email to everyone in school. Everyone knew about it. I started getting emails from everyone in school saying, "Did you really think Alex would like you?" How could I have believed it?
Another group that may be at heightened risk is gay and lesbian teens, as well as those that are questioning their sexuality. Certain environmental factors can contribute to issues with suicide, such as if there are firearms in the home. When a suicide does occur in one particular community, there can be what we call a contagion effect, whereby this occurring in one community can actually affect another troubled youth to actually consider suicide as an option for themselves. So now that you've learned about some of the risk factors and causes that can lead to suicide, there are some imminent signs that you should be aware of, so that if you have a student who's talking about suicide, who's talking about life's not worth living, who is writing about very sad, gloomy topics, This is a student that you really should reach out and try to help. One symptom that you may not see often is a symptom called psychosis. And that's when a young person may be hearing voices that are not there, seeing things that are not there, and maybe acting in a very bizarre manner. There's another student who really requires urgent intervention, who is also maybe at increased risk for a suicide attempt and really needs help as soon as possible.
What I try to do is to get them open to talk about it, because I know when something's wrong. I might bring it to the attention of my principal, and maybe we need to get the parent in to see if we all could, sit at the table and help. A word to the wise for all educators and teachers is be more hands-on with the kids.
Our teachers are really on the front lines here. For the most part, they see more of our children than we do. And they certainly see them in a dimension that we don't. Oftentimes, particularly if you have a child who's depressed, that kid comes home, goes upstairs, shuts the door. There's minimal interaction at dinner. Whenever you can manage to get them out, you get very little exchange. And as I say, trying to discern what is, normal and what is aberrant behavior is very difficult. So our teachers are likely to be able to see, before we do oftentimes, an indicator of hopelessness, and that's really what we're looking for.
Well, one thing that I would like to advise teachers and anyone that's working with young people is not to necessarily worry about, am I getting the right number of symptoms? Has it been lasting for the long, do I have the time period correct? I just think if it's enough that you're thinking about it and you're noticing a combination of symptoms that really seem to be getting in the way of this young person's life, really think about getting that young person help, whether it is to seek out the guidance counselor, if you know the parents and you feel comfortable, bringing it to the parents' attention. I would say have a low threshold in reaching out to that teenager and asking them, are you okay? Do you think anything's changed for you? Do you need any help with anything? And that could really make a big difference for that teenager.
Ms. Robinson, can we talk to you for a second?
Hi, Jim. This is Dave from George Washington. Hey, listen, a group of students came into my office this morning to talk about a friend of theirs.
Hi, I'm calling about my daughter. She's 14, and I'm really worried about her. She's changed so much. She's been really...
Yes, hello. This is Dr. Green calling from Four Corners Pediatric. I'd like to refer one of my patients to you, Delia Simmons.
Hi, my name is Ray, and I'm a junior at Willis High. I'm calling because I can't stop.
When you refer a depressed student to treatment, you are helping to improve more than just their mental health. Students who are successfully treated for depression have improved concentration, memory, and recall, 3 areas critical to academic performance. Increased energy makes it possible for students to pursue sports and other extracurricular activities. Helping students get the treatment they need in order to live fuller, more active lives improves the entire school community.
Okay, any questions on the video or anything we have discussed so far? I saw some questions in the chat. We had a great question regarding the role of genetics, and we'll certainly get to that. Genetics definitely do play a role, and we will discuss that moving forward. Anything else that you've thought of or that you have a question on? Okay, well, I think it's time to take a break then. Does 10 minutes sound okay? So I have 9:19 on my computer, so we'll say 9:30. We'll give you 11 minutes. Say 9:30, come back. Whole extra minute, right? So, okay, so 9:30, we'll restart. Alicia will take over to discuss those mental health disorders in a little more detail, and then we'll move into some other areas. In the meantime, if you think of anything, put it in the chat. We'll check it out.
You guys in the chat have been asking some great questions, and we are going to talk about identified risk factors and the best way to be proactive about that. So I appreciate you guys thinking ahead. We'll get started in a couple more minutes. Is everybody able to see my screen? I accidentally lost like the whole screen on my computer.
I can see it, Alicia.
Great, thank you.
I can see it.
Thank you.
Don't
So
forget to restart the video.
I did
Okay.
already. Thanks.
Yep.
So we're going to move into our next section. And in this session, we're going to talk about focusing on the risk factors, treatment, and warning signs. And I tend to tell a lot of stories. And so I think that sharing stories is a really powerful teaching tool. So when I do this, couple things. One, if something, we keep everything confidential, but if something sounds familiar, let us know privately in the chat and we can talk to you about it, because some of these, we have kids that cross different barriers, and we may have similar students or have had the same student. Also, they suggest you have 2 trainers. And the reason we do this is that there's always one of us available to chat offline. So if something would trigger you while we're talking about anything, that you let us know, because we want to make sure that, you know, you get some support and you have the right resources to talk with somebody. So this year is going to be really different. This year, coming back from a pandemic, is going to be like no other year that we've ever had. And so with everything, the information that we're giving you about risk factors and how to think about your students, we really want you to change your expectations, because the expectations that we had from year to year coming back are going to be very, very different because of the gaps in education, because of, you know, being remote, being in person. So we just want you to kind of keep that in mind. So we're going to start with risk factors for teen suicide. And when we look at those risk factors, and Jamie said this earlier, 90% of all suicides are with groups that are undiagnosed, untreated, or ineffectively treated mental health disorders. So 9 out of 10 people who die by suicide have a treatable mental health condition, but just aren't receiving the treatment. So I forgot I have to move it forward. So in the video, they did talk about common mental health conditions, and we're going to talk about these as well. We're going to not go in as much detail, but if you have specific questions, please put them in the chat and we definitely will address them. We also will be talking and adding in about special needs students. So those are things that aren't in the other training that we have added. So when we look at major depressive disorder, we talked about it persisting for at least 2 weeks. And again, it's people feeling sad, depressed, overwhelmed, hopeless, to that point, that they're not able to kind of see what reality is. So they're in this hopeless place. A lot of times we see a lot of excessives with major depressive disorder. So excessive weight loss or weight gain, excessive sleeping or not sleeping, you know, fatigue. And a lot of times kids are going to have difficulty concentrating. So you kind of pair together, we have all these kids that have been doing online work. We're asking them to come back into school and sit in a desk, but they may be depressed or from isolation or from issues that have been going on at home. And now we're asking them to sit in a seat and pay attention. So we have an uphill battle, but I want you guys to just keep that in mind, and that we're looking for those excesses that are different in our students and what we see. Excuse me. When we look at the autistic spectrum disorder, so many of the signs of autism are so similar with depression. And so having that flat affect, minimal reactivity to others, avoiding being social, eating or sleeping habits that are unusual and low energy. With people on the spectrum, there's many times that diagnosis of depression is overshadowed. And when that happens, we have students that are on the spectrum, but then also depressed. And we take that as their normal behavior. I once had a student in one of my programs that when he came to us, very, very flat affect, to the point where I would practice trying to get him to smile, because I thought that his face muscles had atrophied from not smiling. And so we started to see him get quieter, talking less, and with the affect that he did show, less affect. And I spoke with his mom and we said, you know, let's get him to the psychiatrist and check his medication. So about a week later, I went back to the classroom and I saw the student. And as I walked in, a huge smile on his face. And he said, "Good morning, Miss Alicia, how are you?" And I said, "Did you start taking a new medicine?" And he said, "I did." And I said, "Let me call your mom." And so I called his mom and she said, "It is crazy how much more affectionate he is right now than he's ever been." So, you know, again, are we looking at, is this autism, or is there an underlying depression that we're not seeing? We know that adults with depression are 3 times more likely to, adults with ASD are 3 times more likely to have depression. So if that's more likely in adults, we have to look at how is that in our students as well. Bipolar disorder is, what used to be called manic depression, and it's that fluctuation between depression and mania. So a lot of times when somebody's in a mania, we might see inflated self-esteem, lack of sleep, that they are just on top of the world. They can do anything, they can finish anything, they can fix anything. And in that time, there's a lot of more risky behaviors. So there might be excessive spending, there might be drugs and alcohol, driving recklessly. But then when that person rolls into a depression, they may not be able to get out of bed. Now, those are extremes. There's also bipolar that is for adolescents, a little bit more fast altering. So in the beginning of the day, they might be in a great mood, and then 2 minutes later, they drop and they're crying, and then they spike again and they're angry and they're screaming. And so having that lack of emotional control, we can see. So, bipolar can look very different in adults as it can in children. Generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD or GAD, is that excessive uncontrolled worrying. It's worrying about worrying about worrying. It's when they wake up, they start worrying and they have that knot in their stomach. They're basically in fight or flight. So if you're in fight or flight all the time, you're going to be tired. You're also going to have a lot of difficulty concentrating. So it's important to remember that when we see these kids that are, worried about everything, worried about their tests, we need to look at how worried are they and how much is this affecting them academically? Because if the worrying is impeding their learning, that's something we definitely need to address. So conduct disorder, we typically see more in high school. In elementary and middle school, usually we see oppositional defiant disorder. And so the big difference between those, oppositional defiant disorder are those students that just fight against control. And so if you say it's red, they say it's green, nothing that you say is right. And they're going to say the opposite all the time. So they're constantly fighting against authority or fighting against being controlled. The difference with conduct disorder is the person is fighting against being controlled and fighting against the norms, but they're also trying to control you and trying to manipulate you. So it's not just, I don't want to do what you're telling me to do. I'm not going to do what you're telling me to do, and I'm going to get you to do it for me. So it's important that we, understand with conduct disorder that it can move into violence. It can move into more of a criminality than just a behavioral deficit. Schizophrenia is one of those diseases that needs to be medicated. So schizophrenia cannot be managed without medication. And it's really when somebody has a difficulty interpreting reality and relating to others. So we see this with people that are having delusions, hallucinations, they're hearing voices. Sometimes they have disorganized speech or even have catatonic behavior where they just kind of sit and are like statues. They also can have some negative symptoms where they lose motivation, lose energy. They really show no emotion, and they're just kind of like blank slates that want to be alone. Schizophrenia, we typically see between the ages of 18 to 30 is when they typically come out. We see it more in males. However, it's not exclusive to males, and nor is it exclusive to the age range of 18 to 30. Unfortunately, there are many cases of childhood schizophrenia where we see children as old as 6 or 7 being diagnosed with schizophrenia. With substance abuse, this is kind of hard to decipher sometimes because which came first, the chicken or the egg? You know, is somebody using substances because they're depressed and they're trying to self-medicate? Or is somebody using substances and then becomes depressed because they're using a depressant like alcohol? Basically, when we look at substance use, we're looking at people that are increasing their tolerance. They're withdrawing from people, but using is more important to them. Even if they have consequences, it doesn't affect them. They will continue to want to use because they're in a disorder where that's all they're wanting to do. They're failing to fulfill major obligations, and no matter what consequences happen, we keep seeing them coming back and doing the same thing. So lastly, we're going to talk about eating disorders. I'm sure you guys are familiar with these. Anorexia nervosa is restricting food intake. It's that intense fear of being fat. A lot of times they can even have a disturbance in how they look at themselves. So they look in the mirror and they might be 90 pounds, but they see a person that they feel is overweight. With bulimia, this is when people binge and then purge. So eliminating food that they eat. This can be done through purging or through excessive exercise. So, with our athletes, we need to be aware of them also. For those of you that have cafeteria duty, looking and watching students and looking for patterns. If you see a pattern of a student not eating, playing with their food, or even binge eating, and then immediately excusing themselves to use the restroom, it's important to kind of keep track of that and then talk to somebody else about it to, share kind of point of views and make sure that it's just not you are the only one seeing this. So looking at students with disabilities, on top of those risk factors, they can also have the risk factors that come with having a disability. So whether they have impulsive or aggressive tendencies, poor coping skills or problem solving skills. Nowadays, a lot of our students in general, whether they have a disability or not, have poor problem solving skills. So, making sure we're focusing on that. Social isolation, some kids may be unwilling to seek help. Depending on what their home life is, they may have a caretaker, they may have lost caretakers, conflicts with parents. Any of these things can be additional risk factors for our students that have special needs. When we look at the autistic spectrum disorder and risk factors, we know that a lot of students have dysfunctional emotional awareness. So they may not be aware of how they're actually feeling. They may not understand how other people are feeling or their emotions. A lot of our kids have special interests or topics in morbid things or thoughts of death. I had a student once that was so focused on war and Hitler, and that's all he wanted to talk about. So, we had to work on how can we change what he's talking about to make it more friendly that other people would want to talk with him. Also, students may not have an understanding of the finality of death. When we look at students who probably have some impaired communication or maybe ID, and we see an increase of non-suicidal injurious behavior, that can also be a risk factor. So looking at our students that are nonverbal is really important, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. We talked about the diagnostic overshadowing, which is, attributing autistic behaviors to autism rather than to a mental health disorder. Clinical samples suggest that suicide occurs more frequently in high functioning autism. So that's another thing to be aware of. Your students that are more high functioning may be more aware of the deficits that they have. They may be more aware of they want to be social, but they don't know how to do it. And so that can be discouraging and can result in a depression. And then any type of physical, sexual, or bullying definitely increases risk factors. Students with ID, anything that has to do with immediate stressors with the family, if there's any history of abuse similar to, history of abuse is just one of the risk factors in general. Again, they talk about students with a higher IQ being higher risk factor because of their awareness and possibly their ability to plan things out better. Studies have shown that about 30 to 64% of children and adolescents with ID develop a comorbid mental health disorder. So, they have ID, and then on top of that, we get anxiety or depression or bipolar. There can be multiple morbidities or mental health disorders that fall with that student. The more of those mental health disorders or risk factors that we have, the higher they are for suicide. And then methods of attempts can be very atypical. So students with ID may think, I'm gonna run into the street and be killed, which they actually could, or I'm gonna bite an electrical wire. So some of these things can be so out of what we might think that that's how students may actually get hurt or may actually complete suicide. So we know that 2 out of 3 teens with depression don't get treatment. And we talked about this earlier. So if 2 out of 3 teens with diabetes didn't get treatment, that would be fatal. We need to start looking at mental health and depression just like a medical condition. There's no difference between heart disease and a mental health condition. Mental health is a brain disease, a brain disorder. So we really want to model that for our students and share that with them so that we can change the stigma. So when we talk about mental health treatment, we know that teens can show improvement in 4 to 6 weeks with psychotherapy alone. So we know that talking helps. Again, we're not asking you to be social workers, psychologists, or counselors, but we do know that when you talk to kids about things and you bring it up, it is going to help and it is an intervention. Most others experience significant reduction in symptoms with antidepressants and medication. And I talked about schizophrenia, but also bipolar disorder. Those 2 conditions have to be treated with medication. And when we see instances, it's typically because somebody has gone off their medication. Typically, they start feeling good or feeling better and think, I don't need it, or they don't like how the medication makes them feel, so they will stop using the medication. With mental health treatment, it is individualized to each person. It's nothing that works for one person is going to work for the other. It's going to be different for everybody, and we need to find the right combination of whether it be psychotherapy, an antidepressant, or behavior modification that is going to help that person. A lot of people are concerned about using medication, and I think that because medication, it takes a while to find what works for that person, it can be difficult for people to stay with it and say, okay, let me try a different one. So we know that there are a lot of medications out there that work and that are tested and research-based. So keeping that in mind when we are looking at treatment, and I think keeping an open mind to it as well. So treatment is effective for 8 out of 10 people with depression. So 80% of people that are getting treatment are getting better from depression. Like I said, no single approach works for everyone, and they can have a depression or a mental health illness and get treatment and be fine, but it can reoccur. And so when that happens, it's just that they have to go back to treatment. There are some people that will have one bout of a mental health disorder and that'll be it. But again, it's different in every person, and being able for us to relay that to students, I think is important as well. So when we talk about treatment, we don't want to just think about psychotherapy and medication. We also want to stress to our students that having a healthy lifestyle can help with anxiety, stress, depression. And I think we all can really relate to this going through a pandemic and, you know, not being able to go out, being in your house. A lot of people talked about the COVID-19, you know, that people were in their house so much that they gained weight, became a little bit more depressed, you know, didn't want to work out. And it's like a vicious cycle. So if we can teach our students that incorporating exercise, mindfulness, healthy eating can help and relieve some of that stress and anxiety, you know, that's going to give them another alternative to drugs and alcohol, or, you know, just living in that state of depression or anxiety. Jamie and I do another training on mindfulness. And one thing we really stress is, you know, teaching students how to use mindfulness as a tool. So, you know, practicing a mindfulness exercise every day with students, and then right before a test, practicing that mindfulness technique can then show them, oh, this is a tool that I can use, and I can start using this when I need it. You know, prior to coming from the break, I took some deep breaths and just calmed myself down because I knew I was going to be talking a lot. So using and showing them that it's okay to use mindfulness, it's okay to use these breathing exercises, I think is really important. So we're going to start looking at the risk factors, but before we do, are there any questions so far about what we've talked about, any of the disorders or treatment? Okay. So when we looked at the interacting variables or the interacting risk factors of suicide, if we focus just on mental health, we're not going to get the full picture. And suicide is very complex. I mean, there are so many different layers that kind of go with suicide. And so we look at biological factors, psychological factors, and past history. And I think people asked about those in the chat. And so those three are those underlying risk factors that we don't always see. With biological factors, we're looking at how someone predispositions to mental health or drugs and alcohol, you know, any type of genetic disposition that they may have. Psychological factors, we're looking at how somebody sees themselves, personality or character traits. Are they a perfectionist? You know, how do they perceive events, or how do they perceive interactions with other people? Are they thinking, oh, I'm always the victim, everybody's out to get me? You know, those are those different psychological factors. And then past history, you know, is there a history of suicide in the family? Is there a recent loss or a recent trauma that just occurred? You know, those are those underlying factors that we don't always see. And those factors can lead to, you know, a lot of hopelessness and a depression. When we look at the current life events, yeah.
Can I just add about the biological part? Any physical change to the brain as well. I do some work in the field of brain injury, and even with mild traumatic brain injuries like concussion, but certainly more moderate and severe ones as well, that can have a huge impact on mental health and on suicide attempts. We see a huge emotional change in people who've experienced some sort of brain injury. So along with the genetics and things that fall under biological factors, that could fall under there too. In addition to the psychological and the current life events that come along with that, because oftentimes these students are being asked to give up sports or activities they love. You know, they're having to reconcile who they are now with who they were. They're struggling in school, and so the biological factor of the brain change, in combination with all the other things, can put those kids at pretty high risk for mental health concerns and even suicide. So someone we want to keep an eye on.
I think we probably need to add a slide for that.
Yeah, probably.
When we look at those current life events, a lot of times when there is a completed suicide, this is what the media looks at. You know, what were the things that were occurring that could have been the cause and effect of this tragedy? And as humans, we always want to know, why did this happen? And you know, what was the cause that made this happen? And so a lot of times, you know, we may see that they're reporting the student broke up with a girlfriend, somebody lost their job, they failed a test. And so those current life events are sometimes can be said, oh, that's the reason why it happened. But they're not looking at all those underlying risk factors that could also be, you know, adding to the risk of suicide. So when we look at some external factors, bullying is one of those factors that we see on a daily basis. You know, you guys have all been educated in bullying prevention. And so bullying is one of the big things that the media will look at as a current event. You know, oh, they were bullied and that's why they killed themselves. And that is not always the case. What we do know is that students that are both the bully and the victim and have been physically aggressive are more likely to engage in suicidal ideation or suicidal behaviors than their peers that don't bully. But also it's less common in people that are verbal bullies or people that were just victims but not bullies. So I had a student once that part of what Jamie and I do is we go to the private schools and do observations. And so I was at a school doing an observation in a kindergarten, and I'm observing this little boy, and the teacher said, it's circle time. Let's, you know, everybody have a seat. And so the student went to sit down, and then he wanted to sit by somebody and there was no spot, and he started crying, and he's like, there's no place for me to sit. I want to sit next to this person. And the teacher said, you know, you're going to have to move out or come sit over here. And so then he pushed the person that wouldn't move. And the teacher was like, no, you need to stop. So, you know, in a matter of seconds, he was a victim and then he went to a bully. And so I saw this multiple times throughout the observation. After the fact, I met with the teacher and I said, you know, he does fluctuate from being a bully and victim. And I said, as he gets older, you know, one thing to be aware of that this can be a risk factor for suicidality. And she said, oh no, we don't have to wait until he gets older. He already is threatening suicide. And so in kindergarten, we had somebody threatening to jump out of a window, jump out of his car when it's moving. So we can't say that, you know, suicide doesn't target younger people, because it definitely does. And there's no age limit that we can put on it. So when we want to start identifying at-risk students, you know, I said before, this year is going to be very different because we've had a year and a half of students operating very differently than they have in the past. You know, students that maybe were in class online while they were laying on their couch, or with a parent right next to them, so that, you know, anytime the student started talking, the parent would mute it so that it didn't disrupt the class. But what that results in is students who aren't able to have classroom management skills or aren't able to, you know, follow the expectations of class. So coming back in, we may see some of these things as, oh, this student is having problems. Oh, this student needs evaluated. And so we don't want to just attribute things to like, oh, this is just part of the mood swings of a teenager, or this child is so lazy, or they have a poor attitude. We want to look at, how was this student before the pandemic, if you have that information, and look at, you know, what are some of the home issues? What are some of the past background things that we can look at? I had another observation where I was observing a student, And I think he was probably a 6th grader, maybe 7th grader. And as I was in the class, you know, he sat there, he was doing nothing. He did not write anything down. He didn't do any of the reading. He put his head down a couple times. He wasn't a problem where he was acting out or anything, but he just wasn't doing anything. And so when I met with the teacher, she said, he is just so lazy and defiant and just doesn't want to do anything. And I said, wow, I said, you know, let's do a behavior rating scale, because, you know, I'm seeing that possibly this might be a depression. And so we did the behavior rating scale, and sure enough, it came back that he had high levels in depression. And so when we were at a meeting with the teacher and the mother and the principal, I said, you know, has anything changed recently or in the past year? Because they said the year before he was a great student. And they said, well, yeah, the mom, he no longer lives with the mother. He lives with the grandfather, who is a quadriplegic, and he has to drive, you know, he has to take a bus for 45 minutes to get to the school now. And so it was all these things that had really were risk factors. So when we met with the mom, you know, she started crying and she said, oh my gosh, you know, I had depression at his age. Why didn't I see that? I should have known that. So just in that one case, we have, you know, issues that are happening at home. We have a history of or a genetic predisposition to depression, and, you know, all these risk factors piling up, and nobody thought to say, hey, maybe this might be depression rather than this child is lazy. So we're going to start looking at the warning signs. And risk factors are long lasting, and they're a signal to be proactive. They're a signal to, hey, we might want to intervene and talk to this student. When we look at warning signs, these are the signs that are saying, don't let this kid be alone. This student is at imminent risk for suicide or for harming themselves in some way. So we really want to understand the differences. Those with the risk factors, we all can have risk factors for high cholesterol or diabetes. You know, it could run in our family. We might be overweight, or, you know, somebody could smoke. So there's all these different risk factors, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have heart disease or that you're going to get diabetes. With the warning signs, this is more imminent. This is potentially going to happen really quickly, and we need to be very aware of it. Did you have something you wanted to say, James?
No, I'm good.
So the first warning sign is talking. And if we have somebody that is talking about killing themselves, talking about how they have no reason to live, you know, that they have this kind of unbearable physical pain, or not physical, I'm sorry, psychological pain, you know, this is when we really need to pay attention and understand that just saying, I'm going to kill myself isn't like a thing that we say anymore, because we need to take that more seriously. We need to change the stigma. And the more that we educate students that using I'm going to kill myself as a sign of being overwhelmed, you know, if we can change that stigma, then people might take suicide a little bit more seriously. They may, you know, we may have more research coming up. So making sure when somebody says, I wish I wasn't here anymore, I'm going to kill myself, or anything that makes you feel like there is an issue, ask them about it. Say something, start the conversation, because if you start the conversation, that's an intervention in and of itself. When we look at behaviors, we really need to look at behavior changes. So we talked about those excesses before, an increase in drinking, eating, not eating, sleeping, not sleeping. If they're searching on Google ways to end their life, or they're part of reading a blog about somebody who, you know, wants to kill themselves. There's so many things online that students can find now. You know, being aware of what they're researching, I think, is really important and can give us a lot of information. If we have students that are acting more reckless, taking more risks, that can be a sign. Withdrawing from activities, people that start pulling away or isolating from friends and family, pulling away from sports teams that they're on, saying goodbye to people, apologizing excessively to people, or even giving away things. In some students, we can even see an increase in aggression. You know, with depression in adolescence, sometimes depression will come out as agitation, aggression, rather than being depressed and being sad or crying all the time. So lastly, people who are considering suicide often display one or more of the following moods. So mood can be a very telling warning sign as well. When we're looking at, if we see people that typically have been happy and now all of a sudden they're depressed, they're not coming to school, they're dropping out of things, they get into a rage quickly, you know, they can become very irritable, or they're showing a lot of anxiety. You know, any of these mood changes can really be a huge warning sign. Another thing that we see is if somebody who is acting depressed, or I'm sorry, not acting, but showing signs of depression, and then all of a sudden they start acting really happy. And, you know, a lot of times that can be, that person has said in their mind, this is it, I know what I'm going to do, I have my plan, and they can relax a little bit. Sometimes it's also taking medication, and when somebody starts taking an antidepressant, they get a little bit more motivation, and they have enough motivation to then follow through with their suicide plan. So simply noticing and asking somebody, are you okay? You know, are you thinking of killing yourself? Do you wish you were dead? Being straightforward and asking, I think, is really important, because it just lets kids know, you know what, I noticed something's going on and I care. And that in and of itself, again, is an intervention. So when we look at warning signs for nonverbal students, you know, this we really need to rely on the outward behaviors, because they're not able to, you know, possibly communicate it to us other than behaviors. We have to be aware. So knowing students' kind of baseline behavior, how do they typically behave? I had one student that was a very docile student. He was probably about 17, and he would come up and very nonverbal, but he would say a couple words, but always very calm and sweet. And so all of a sudden, he started coming upstairs and he would run down the hallway and he would punch somebody and then run back to his classroom. And so this happened on a couple days in a row. And I'm like, we got to figure out what's going on here. So we call the parents and say, hey, has anything changed? Because we're seeing some different behaviors than we've seen before. And they said, oh yeah, the brother just came home from the service, and we typically have very structured week. Like Monday, they went to Red Robin, Tuesday, they had pizza at home. You know, it was very structured. And so when the brother came home and disrupted the structure, we saw a change in his behaviors. So when he did go to the psychiatrist, they did put him on a low dose antidepressant, and those behaviors stopped, and we saw, you know, the normal behaviors that we were used to of that student come back. So when we have students with special needs, sometimes they may use suicidal threats as their go-to kind of verbiage to let some of them know that they're upset. Again, knowing a student's baseline and understanding the intent for why they're saying, I'm going to kill myself. You know, is it to escape? Is it out of frustration? Or is it truly to harm themselves? So we want to teach students how to label their feelings and how to give them, you know, give them different verbiage that's more proactive and more appropriate than letting them use the same, I'm going to kill myself over and over. So we need to consider, do they have access to any ways to harm themselves? And then make sure you have a strong working relationship with the child's treatment team. So if they have wraparound services, you know, knowing, is there any type of plan that goes with this student? And so I'll give you another example of something that I experienced. I had a student who was probably 6'4", about 320, so a large student, and on the spectrum. And so we noticed that when he got upset or he didn't want to do something, he would say, I'm going to kill myself, or I'm going to kill you. It was one or the other. And we talked to his outside therapists, and they said, oh, that's just, he just says that, he doesn't mean it. And we said, okay. So we continued to work with him. And at one point we were outside walking around, and he picked up a big log and was kind of swinging it around. And I said, you need to put that down. And he said, you need to shut up. And I said, you need to put that down. And he said, I'm gonna kill myself. And he dropped the log and he started to walk back up to our building. And so I followed him up to the building, and there was another staff member in the building. But when I came in, he had already gone into the kitchen. And so I went into the kitchen and I said, you know, what are you doing? And he's like, nothing. And I said, you need to come out of there. And he said, you need to shut the F up. And I'm like, come on, let's come out. And he said, I'm going to kill somebody's going to get hurt. And he pulled out a huge butcher knife. And I was like, oh man, this is not good. So I said, you need to put the knife down and you need to come out of the kitchen. And I backed out of the kitchen. And luckily he did put the knife down and come out of the kitchen. We ended up hospitalizing this student. And unfortunately, when he was a wonderful kid. And when he was in a good place, he was great. But when he was in a bad place, it definitely got bad. And so once he was in the hospital and he felt comfortable, you know, he was a great patient. And so they released him. But the one thing that I was concerned about is, you know, are we going to change how this student is expressing that he is not in a good place? You know, can we teach him something different? He no longer went to our school, so that was on somebody else at that point. So we're going to get ready to watch the second video. And in this video, it is focused on or geared towards the students. So you'll notice they don't talk about suicide at all. They focus on depression. They really are depicting the most ideal help-seeking behaviors that teens would do and responses from personnel. This is not, you know, complete realism. This is what we would hope would happen and what we work towards happening. And this may contrast from what some of your families have encountered, some of your students' families, because we know that getting an appointment with a health professional can be very difficult, and is definitely one of the barriers that a lot of our students face. So, does anybody have any questions before we start watching this video? The video is about 24 minutes long.
Nothing in the chat.
Okay. Did I share?
Your video isn't shared, no. Just you unshared your
Oh,
other, but you didn't share the video.
geez. Okay. Sorry about that. volume.
All of us have had a time when we felt down or depressed after a disappointment or sad event. That kind of depression can last a few hours or days and is part of a normal, everyday life. This film is not about that kind of depression. It's about depression, a medical illness, one that lasts weeks or months or even years. It's sometimes known as major depression. This film will show how depression affected 4 teenagers. They each had different experiences, but what they had in common is that each one was changed by depression. It took away their self-confidence, and while they were depressed, none of them were enjoying their lives. Depression can cause you to have low energy, lose interest in things you used to enjoy, and can make it hard to get along with people. When you're depressed, it can be difficult to concentrate, to be positive, or to express how you're thinking and feeling. You might get irritated easily or find yourself criticizing other people or yourself. Depression that has not been treated can affect different people in different ways. Some depressed people may use alcohol or illegal drugs as a way to deal with depression. Others may become suicidal. If you recognize any signs of depression in yourself or a friend, please follow the advice at the end of this film. Remember, depression is an illness. It can be treated to change a sad, colorless, unhappy life into one with energy and enjoyment. Lana lives with her mother. Until a few months ago, Lana was popular. She had some good friends, she liked school, and her grades were pretty good. She and her mother were really close and told each other everything. Then Lana began to feel sick. She didn't have a fever, but she was tired and had no energy and wanted to sleep all the time. Her pediatrician did lots of tests, but they were normal. But Lana knew something was wrong.
Roosevelt Mental Health Center.
Hi, I'm calling about my daughter. She's 14, and I'm really worried about her. She's not acting like herself. She's not eating. She spends most of the day in bed. She has fallen behind in school, and she cries all the time. I know there's something wrong, but I don't know what to do.
How long have you been noticing this change in your daughter?
Well, the other day I went up to her room, and she didn't answer. Lana? She was just there, staring. Are you sleeping? It's the middle of the day. Is everything all right?
Yeah, I'm just tired.
Your teacher, she said you've been missing school. And when you do show up, you often seem unprepared. Lana, that's so unlike you. What's going on? You've always been such a good student. Lana, what's the matter? Baby, can you talk to me? You want to get up? Come down, have something to eat with me?
Stop, just stop.
You know what? You need to snap out of it. Stop feeling sorry for yourself.
Sometimes parents don't know what to do or how to help when you're depressed. They may misread the situation and say or do things that aren't helpful. Usually it's out of concern or fear.
Your mother told me that she's worried. She said that she tries to talk to you, but when she does, you don't say anything. What's going on?
I don't know. I just feel bad. She thinks I'm lazy. She's right. I am lazy. All I want to do is stay in bed. It's hard to pay attention in class. I can't do work. And my mom already thinks that I don't care about my future, but I care. I just can't deal.
Your mom told me that you stopped calling your friends.
I just don't feel like talking to anyone. When I'm with my friends, it's like I'm not even there. They probably think I'm lame. I don't know.
Lana has clear signs of depression. She has no energy. She can't concentrate, and some days she doesn't even go to school. When her mother gets tired and criticizes her, Lana cries and blames herself. These are all signs that Lana is depressed.
You know, Lana, when people who are depressed lie around, it gives them too much time to think negative thoughts, which only makes their depression worse. You know, sometimes the best way to stop the negative thoughts is to do something. What do you think you can do when you're feeling stuck like this?
Maybe I can call a friend.
Good. And if your friend says, hey, let's do something, you know, why don't you push yourself to say yes?
Okay, I'll try.
After being in therapy for 6 weeks, Lana was getting better. She was back in school and seeing friends. But each day was a struggle. She still lacked confidence and didn't enjoy herself as much as she used to. So Lana's family doctor added medication to therapy to help get her back to where she was before her depression. There are chemicals in the brain that help the different parts of the brain communicate with each other. If the chemicals get out of balance, this communication can break down and lead to depression. Depressed brains show a decrease in serotonin transporter levels in specific areas of the brain. Medication works to reset the brain's chemistry and is generally used for 6 to 12 months. Ray is very independent, but lately he's been feeling really stressed out. He's always been a worrier, but not like this. When he tries to study, he can't concentrate on the material because he worries about the outcome. Then he freaks out.
Hey, Ray. Congrats on student council, man.
Oh, thanks, man.
Yo, Ray, what time's the game on Saturday?
9 a.m. away game.
Dude, I hear coach is gonna start you.
Yeah, no, he told me. I've been trying to stay cool about it.
Man, that history exam's gonna kill me tomorrow.
I know, I've been studying.
Yeah, you gotta worry.
Yeah, right.
Take my test from me, please. I'll let you, man.
All right, man.
City Hospital Mental Health Clinic.
Hi, yeah, my name is Ray, and I'm a junior at Willis High.
Hi, Ray. What's going on?
I'm calling because I can't stop worrying about things that I don't need to worry about. I don't know, I felt weird and like something was wrong. I decided that I needed to speak to someone.
I'm glad you called. Let me put you through to someone here. Hi, Ray. I'm Ruth. I work here at the clinic.
What's going on?
I was worried because I had this big test, and I always do okay on tests, but I don't know, last night I was just so scared that I couldn't even bring myself to do any work. I knew that I had to study, but I just couldn't concentrate. I just stared at my books. My stomach hurt so much that I just had to lie down. Before I knew it, it was already 3 a.m. in the morning. Everyone thinks that I'm so perfect and that it all comes easy for me, but it doesn't. I worry about everything. I worry about school stuff. I worry about tests. I worry about games. It really does get me down.
Ray, it's good that you called.
That was the right thing to do. How do you feel now?
Wow, yeah, I felt better just talking about it. So, what do I do now? Do I just call you?
Okay, why don't you talk to your family and then you can come see me later this week? How about Friday at 5?
Friday at 5. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Ray shows signs of an abnormal degree of anxiety. Even though he knows he always does well, when he has a test, he feels anxious and afraid. His mind gets frozen. Sometimes this heightened degree of anxiety can lead to depression. The feeling of fear is so great that all Ray can do is cry or feel really sick. When Ray experiences anxiety, the fear takes over his mind. Some people call that psychological pain. It's just as bad as physical pain. Ray's therapist taught him to watch for signs when his anxiety was getting worse, like when he feels his heart racing or shortness of breath. The therapist gave him some tools to help manage his anxiety, like some breathing exercises that helped him calm down and get back in control. Jake likes being part of a crowd that hangs out together, but lately he's been feeling like everybody's in his business. At home, at school, even his friends are on his back. He feels like he's always on edge.
Mr. Robinson, can we talk to you for a second?
Yeah, sure. Come on in, fellas.
So, yeah, this past weekend we went to this party with Jake. And you know how Jake is. He can be chill and really cool. But sometimes, you say something to him and he takes it the complete wrong way.
So we went to this party and we were just walking there and talking about stuff.
But Jake wasn't talking to any of us. And then he picks up this bottle and smashes it on the concrete.
And then we got to this party and he just got angry over nothing.
And then we left because we were heading to CJ's house, but she was like, you can't bring Jake. And I had to tell him that he couldn't come.
Yeah, he got really mad. But he just stared us down. He didn't say anything to us when we left, so, we just wanted to make sure everything was cool.
You guys did the right thing coming by here today. I really appreciate it. Thanks. You guys should probably get back to class, but I'll look into it, okay? Thanks. Hi, Jim. This is Dave from George Washington. Hey, listen, a group of students came into my office this morning to talk about a friend of theirs who's also a student here. They've noticed that he's been getting angry for no obvious reason, and they think he's changed. I'd like to get him to come see you. If he agrees, will you see him?
Jake, you said Mr. Harrison spoke to you and your family about coming in to talk to someone. I know that must have been a difficult decision for you to make. Why don't you tell me what's going on?
I know my friends talked to Mr. Harrison about what happened at the party, and they probably told him that I was the one who did something and that I was the problem, and it was them.
Well, why don't you tell me what happened and we'll figure it out.
We were just hanging out, and then they start acting like a bunch of total jerks. I mean, they're acting like everything they do is right and everything that I do is wrong. I'm just standing out on the deck, and Claire falls into me and spills beer on me. Watch it. What's your problem?
Hey, why are you being such a jerk, man?
Yeah, what's your problem?
You are.
You're not being funny, Jake.
She fell into me, and everyone's acting like I did something wrong. It really pissed me off.
That sounds like a good idea.
Yes. It's all gone.
No more beer left, man.
Yes.
Are you guys serious?
Yeah, we're serious.
Yes.
And then they'd lie and say that the beer is all gone, and they're acting like I'm out of control, and it gets me really mad. Hey! You guys just gonna leave me here?
Yeah, we'll call you.
Just go home, man.
Get some sleep.
Just go home.
Man, you're totally out of control. We can't handle this anymore.
You're just gonna ditch me? And then they ditch me. They just ditch me. They leave me there, and I'm like, fine, I don't need you. Forget you guys. Go to hell.
And these guys are your friends?
Yeah. They don't get me. I mean, they can be total jerks sometimes. It's not just that. It's even at home, I feel like everyone's giving me a hard time, and I know I've been getting mad a lot, and I didn't used to be that way, and now I'm like that all the time, and it's just little things that make me lose it.
Well, why don't you tell me what has changed?
Jake easily loses his temper, especially if he's been drinking alcohol. His outbursts were causing his friends to turn away from him when he really wanted to be around them. Even though Jake knew drinking alcohol was illegal, he thought alcohol would make him feel better. But it didn't. It only made things worse. Losing your temper easily and more often, along with using alcohol to feel better, can be signs of depression. Jake's therapist helped him find ways to avoid situations where he'd be tempted to drink and to say no when there was alcohol around. When Jake's depression did not seem to be lifting after a few months of therapy, his doctor suggested that Jake take an antidepressant. Both the medication and therapy helped Jake. He found that he did better without alcohol and that little things didn't bother him so much anymore. His sense of humor came back, and he could laugh at himself instead of always feeling that people were picking on him. Delia lives with her grandmother in the country. She's never been very confident, and when she was younger, girls used to make fun of her. She's shy. It's hard for her to talk to people. She has a couple of friends at school, but she spends most of her time alone on her computer.
Dr. Allen's office. Yes, hello. This is Dr. Green calling from Four Corners Pediatric. I'd like to refer one of my patients to you, Delia Simmons. She's here with her grandmother because she's had bad stomach aches. She says that she's feeling tired, she refuses to go to school, she's not hanging out with other kids, and she says she's feeling sad. So there may be an emotional component in all of this. I'd like her to meet with someone. Oh, it's going to be a bit of a trip for them, so later in the afternoon might be better.
Delia, your grandmother says you haven't been going to school. Did something happen?
No.
You're not feeling well?
No, I'm sick.
How so?
Just feel bad.
Maybe I'll be able to help you.
You can't.
Talking might make you feel better.
It's embarrassing and stupid.
Well, I'm not gonna laugh, and there's nothing you can say that will surprise me.
So there's this boy, Alex. These girls in my class, they found out I had a crush on him. Those girls, started sending me emails like it was from Alex. He liked me. It was so stupid. But I got those emails and I really thought it was from him. So I wrote him stuff about myself, personal stuff. And then I sent an email that was really personal. And then I sent a picture of myself. And those girls sent my email to everyone in school. Everyone knew about it. I started getting emails from everyone in school saying, "Did you really think Alex would like you?" How could I have believed it? Those girls, they made the whole thing up. There's no way I can go back to school. I just want to disappear.
I'm sorry this happened. Did you tell anyone else about it?
No. And I really don't want to tell my grandmother. She worries enough about me. She has no idea how much I'm picked on at school. I have no one to hang out with. The other day, everyone was just looking and laughing at me. I never want to go back to school. ever.
I know this is very hard for you, and you are doing a great job with talking about it. I just think if we work together, we'll be able to find a way that is manageable for you, and it'll make you feel better.
For a long time, Delia's been feeling sad, isolated, and unaccepted by her peers. This recent humiliation has led her to become more depressed, and that makes it hard for her to think about how to make positive changes in her life. Delia started meeting her therapist once a week to figure out what she can do about her situation. With the help of her therapist, Delia started to feel less bothered by the girls in her school and learned how to ignore them. Delia joined an exercise program at the local community center and started making some new friends there. Once she started exercising, her physical health and outlook improved, and she began to feel better about herself. For someone like Delia, another option might be to change schools, if that's available, to give her a fresh start as she makes positive changes in her life. Jake really improved once he was on medication, and along with therapy, he started to gain control over his emotions. With his anger under control, he was able to interact with his teachers, peers, and family members more positively. Ray worked hard with his therapist, and like a lot of anxious kids, he was very dedicated to improving his situation, and he did well. He still felt overwhelmed in certain circumstances, but he learned how to bring those moods under control. The trick he found worked best for him was a breathing exercise, and over time, the worrying attacks happened less and less often. Lana saw a therapist weekly and stayed on medication for 6 months. She's been doing well in school again and started getting back into things she used to enjoy. There are times she still feels a bit down, but she has learned how to recognize the triggers of depression in herself, and she's learned what she can do to keep it at bay. If you think you're going through depression, you're not alone, and you can feel better. In any given year, in a high school of 1,000 students, 75 girls and 50 boys will be diagnosed with depression. Only 1 out of 3 of them will eventually receive treatment for their depression. You can't do this by yourself, and you don't have to. Talk to someone who knows about depression and can help you. Your parent, a school counselor, your doctor, or an adult you trust. Tell them, I need help. If you recognize signs of depression in a friend, tell them about what you've learned and encourage them to seek help. Depression is a medical illness. Depression can be treated. Get help if you think you or a friend are in trouble, and you can save a life. For help, write down this number, 1-800-273-TALK.
Okay, so I hope you guys could see the difference in between those two videos. You know, with this video targeting students, they really wanted to focus on showing students that everybody can go through a depression, that it is very common, and that they're not abnormal if they're having these feelings. They also wanted to stress that depression is an illness. It's a medical illness. It is not just, I'm going to choose to be depressed. It's definitely something that we need to start focusing on as an illness. Thirdly, that Depression can be brought on by any type of a stressful experience. So it could be the death of someone, it could be the death of a dog or a cat, so anything can trigger somebody into a depression. And that, again, this is something that a lot of people go through. It is a common problem. Also, they wanted to kind of stress that depression doesn't go away on its own. Getting some sort of treatment is, whether that be talk therapy, whether that be medication, is important to treat that just like you would a medical health issue. And then we know that treatment for depression works, and that if it's out there and it's available for people. AFSP did a study and they found that 94% of students that watched this video said they would be comfortable, they felt more comfortable helping a friend if they said that they were suicidal or seeking help for themselves. So although some of the, language was unrealistic, I think that if it's going to target students and help them to feel more comfortable and know where to go for help, that's really important.
And if you decide to share this video to your students, like I said, we can share it with you. It also comes with a worksheet that has like questions, leading questions. Who would you be most likely to recognize as being depressed? Who would you be least likely to recognize as depressed? So discussion starters with your students as well. So it's not just a video on its own. There's a follow-up, and we can provide you with all that if that's something you choose to do as a district or as a class.
Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break. So get up, stretch your legs a little bit. We're in like the last part of this, so not much longer. But get up and walk around, come back at around 10:50, and we will see you guys then.
Okay, so if we want to reconvene, that's been about 5 minutes. Give you guys a second to refocus here. And I'll get refocused. So as Alicia said, we're going to get started again. We're in the home stretch here. And so we want to make sure, though, we've presented you with all this, difficult information today, that we're going to talk about some barriers that are out there, but we're also going to talk about how to overcome those barriers and how we can help the students. So you have all the background information now on risk factors, genetics. Hopefully we answered all your questions on those sort of things. If not, like I said, please feel free to ask again. We want to talk about what you can do at this point. So we all know that there's a lot of barriers to treatment for teens. And these are some of them, but again, as I go through these, I want you to think about ways that we can overcome them. One of the big things is that neither teens nor the adults who are close to them recognize the symptoms of their illness, let alone as being an illness, but also as being something that's treatable. Oftentimes, it just gets chalked up to them being a moody teenager, right? Or just, having mood swings, or being defiant or lazy or things like that. And Alicia discussed some of those things before. And many times that's not, it's not purposeful. The intention would still be there to help them, but they just don't see it as a treatable illness because they're not educated in this field. And so, again, educating our students can be very important. Educating parents can be helpful as well. But I'm sure we've all been in situations where the adults were the barrier, the parents were the barrier, even if they recognize it, it's getting them to follow through with treatment and things like that that can become very difficult. There is a fear of what treatment might involve. Alicia said earlier that people are afraid of medication. They're afraid of side effects. They're afraid of talking to someone and telling them they feel this way, that they might get in trouble. So there's a fear of what treatment might involve. And so again, the education piece there is huge in preventing that barrier. There's a belief that nothing can help. If you think about, we're working with a population who's very illness. One of the symptoms is hopelessness. And so we're trying to tell them that we can help them. And it's very hard to sort of break down that wall and get through to them because they are feeling hopeless. And so getting through to them can be difficult, and especially when they try something and it doesn't work. And oftentimes these treatments are trial and error. And so getting them to continue and follow through can be hard. It can be definitely a barrier. Not seeing help seeking as a sign of strength is another barrier, especially as we said in the male population, and that just has to do so greatly with the stigma that's out there. So I don't know how many of you have seen those commercials with Michael Phelps, for example. Having people like him, I think, speak out about the fact that they go to therapy can be so helpful because kids see this Olympian, this major athlete who needed help and sought it out and had good results. And hopefully that will help them to not see it as a sign of weakness to seek help themselves. People are embarrassed. Again, that stigma is there. They're embarrassed they need help. They can't control their own emotions. And thinking of it as that physical health thing again, no one's embarrassed about heart disease. No one's embarrassed about stomach ulcers, but you're embarrassed about mental health when, again, that's just a disease of your brain as anything else. There is a belief that adults won't understand. And, we were all kids once. We've all been through things. But the truth of it is, at least in my own experience, some of you guys are way younger than me, but things aren't the same as they were when I was growing up. In high school, there was no social media. There was a chance to turn that all off when you go home. So things are different. But again, being open-minded, being open to learning, being open to hearing what they have to say without being judgmental can be so important in helping to overcome that barrier. And just, kind of laying the groundwork ahead of time that you have that open communication policy and that you'll try to understand, even if it's different than when you went through it, can be very preventative. A couple other things that can help to overcome these barriers is that every health insurance plan has to cover some aspect of mental health care. I know insurance can be something that gets in the way as well, or funding or things like that. There are a lack of providers out there, so we know that can be difficult too. Alicia mentioned earlier about talking to a professional and making sure you talk to a professional. But if the first line of defense is the pediatrician until you can get to someone else, then that might be the route some of your students have to take. But eventually it's important that they're monitored by someone who specializes in the field, especially if they're taking medications. But every insurance plan has to cover some aspect of mental health care. There are also many free services out there. Becoming aware of them in your community can be very helpful. Realizing what's out there so you can link your students up. And then the other thing is that if parents are a barrier, students 14 years of age or older can get help themselves. So they are able to access mental health treatment on their own if they're 14 years of age or older. So again, I know that can still be a concern, but it is something that can help to overcome some of the barriers. Specifically, how you can help a student at risk. We talked about this already, but identifying those students whose behavior suggests the presence of a mental health condition. You are the front lines. You have the window into the world that nobody else does. And so being able to recognize those changes and knowing what to do with them is so important. Simply expressing concern. There was a research study done that looked at kids who were at high risk for suicide. And what they found was that having just one adult who connected with them and who checked in was enough to make a difference. And that adult did not have to be a parent. It could be a teacher. It could be someone at the school.
Oh, I stopped sharing.
Yeah. What's that?
Yeah, there you go.
Guys, okay? It could be someone else. So it doesn't have to be a parent. And then again, knowing what to do with that information once you have it, referring the student to the proper person within your school, knowing your school policies, your building policies would be really important. What can help students stay safe? Well, receiving effective mental health care when needed. We talked a lot about how just talking can make a difference, and it certainly can. But when we talk about talking to a professional, it's different than talking to a friend, talking to a parent. Those professionals know strategies, know techniques to sort of rewire kids' brains, and that's what's often needed. So talking can help, but sometimes it has to be talking with a professional that knows the way to lead the conversation and the questions to ask and the practices to do to sort of rewire that child's brain. So receiving effective mental health care is very, very helpful. Helping the student to foster positive connections, whether it's to their family or whether it's in school to peers or to teachers or to other groups, other social institutions or extracurricular activities. You want them in places where they're going to be able to foster resilience. Children have resilient brains, but they have to be put in the right situations for that resilience to happen. Creating a safe and supportive school and community environment. Again, these are things that happen before, preventative things that we can do so that they know they feel safe at school. Some kids, we know, don't have the best home life and they may not feel safe, there. But we hope that when they come to school, they feel like they've come to a safe environment, and at least for that part of their day, they're able to feel like they're in a safe environment. The kids that don't have that at home, those are the ones we want to be particularly concerned about as they return to school this year, because just simply being off for the summer is something that, sometimes they've experienced some negative things, but also now with the pandemic, they've been home for a really long time. And so being sure that we're extra aware of those kids that maybe are coming out of those environments and being sure they feel safe when they come to school. Helping teens to cultivate problem-solving skills. Again, we live in a generation of poor problem solvers, I think today, for the most part anyway. So putting those tools in their toolbox before they need them, teaching them to talk through things, teaching them to work through problems, modeling your problem-solving skills when you have them. Alicia and I also teach a curriculum called PATHS. It's promoting alternative thinking strategies. And the PATHS program has a lot to do with problem solving. And in the very young ages, they simply teach the students a problem or a skill called turtling, where they basically, go into their shell and identify the problem and they stop. It prevents them from lashing out, it prevents them from being impulsive. It doesn't even go through the rest of the steps at that point, but eventually it gets to there. So, but it starts with just simply stopping and identifying the problem and then moves into the other problem solving skills. And then keeping open communication, specifically regarding mental health concerns, but if you establish that you're open to talking, then they will feel more comfortable sharing those mental health concerns with you.
James, I just wanted to add, with coming back to school this year, establishing those connections and helping kids feel safe are going to be really important, because we have lost a year and a half of that. So, establishing the structure in the classroom, greeting your students at the door, just having that interaction, maybe even having to reteach to them how to address an adult or how to have a conversation, how to make contact when you enter a room, shake somebody's hand and say good morning, because those things, have kind of gone by the wayside. So, this year, as opposed to any other year, we have to be really in touch with where our students are and that they feel comfortable with us. There was a research study done by Garcia and Weiss from the Economic Policy Institute. And we can share that with you guys if you want. It's a really good article, but it looks at research from the pandemic. And what they found was that, unless students had consistent access to internet, Wi-Fi, computers, and teachers that were trained in online instruction, that there will be huge deficits if students didn't have that. And we know that, the gaps that we had in education before are just going to widen. So any of those students low-income students that may have had a gap prior to returning now, if they had no internet access, if they had no computer and they weren't consistent with it, we're going to see even larger gaps. One of the things that they talk about and saying that is the biggest thing to do is to screen these students. And so we need to find out where they are academically, emotionally, physically, and start from that point. Because if we are teaching a 7th grade class and we expect all these 6th graders to come in ready for 7th grade, we're going to be sorely, mistaken and upset, because we can't expect that right now. We know there's going to be deficits. We know there's going to be a gap. So we just want to kind of keep that in mind and stress that to you guys as well. Jamie just left. And she's back.
I'm back. The hazards of working at home, my oven was going off and my daughter was supposed to get it out and had disappeared. So, okay, so we're back. We're teaching resiliency here, right? And bouncing back and adapting. So resiliency refers basically to the capacity of a student or any individual to overcome odds and overcome adversity and cope with hardship. And so these are skills that can be taught and honed in our students. Resiliency is a huge area of research as to why some people are more resilient than others, but we want to do our best to try to start to teach these skills at a young age, and by again teaching effective problem solving, teaching them to take perspective of a situation, so being able to have empathy and see other people's perspective and understand how they would feel can be helpful in resiliency. Understanding sarcasm and jokes, and we know especially with our students maybe who are on the spectrum, that is very difficult for them. They're very concrete and literal, so they may not understand sarcasm and jokes. Teaching them to manage their stress is huge. Giving them those stress management techniques, those mindfulness techniques, and then teaching them flexible thinking. Change is constant. We've all learned that in the last year, right? If we hadn't known it already, that we have to be adaptable and be able to adjust to things. And we know that we have students who any little change in their routine, sets them off, whether they have special needs or not. And so those are students that we want to work with to teach them the value of flexible thinking and teach them to be a little more pliable as they're adapting to their environment around them. And that will help to decrease their risk for suicide and mental health concerns as well. Another helpful tool is to encourage self-advocacy. We want to assist students with identifying their strengths and weaknesses and, playing to their strengths. Everybody has a strength, you can find them in there somewhere. And so helping them to do things that play to their strengths. And again, seeing their weaknesses not as something that they can't overcome, but we want to recognize their weaknesses so that they can find ways to adapt for them. I'm short, so I use a step stool. That's a weakness that I use a tool for. Or kids who struggle with organization. They use an organizer where they write in as opposed to just their phone. Maybe if they need a little extra, that's a tool. And so teaching kids to use those tools to support their weaknesses can be really helpful.
I think also, sorry. Thinking about how we are asking students to do things, and are we asking them or making them problem solve and have some critical thinking skills? Because we want them to think through the steps. A lot of times students will ask us a question and want us to give them the answer. And so if we're thinking more than the students are thinking, we probably need to stop and take a step back, because we want students to be advocates for themselves, that they can think through problems. So if a student says, what do I have next period? Instead of saying, oh, you have English, you might say, I don't know, where could you find that answer? And now they have to go through a series of steps to think about, how do I get there? And we're making them think.
Okay, good. So we talked a lot about bullying earlier in regard to suicide. Certainly bullying isn't the only contributing factor to suicide, but we know that it can be one of those surface things that we see, that if someone is already struggling with their mental health, can contribute. It can be one of those straws on the camel's back, right? So giving kids the ability to speak out for oneself is an important skill when addressing bullying. And even if they don't feel strong enough to speak out to the person who's bullying them, maybe they're comfortable enough to speak out to an adult, or maybe as a bystander, they're comfortable enough to speak out to an adult. Those are all valuable self-advocacy tools. Praising them when they make a good decision. So giving them that positive feedback, when you see them doing something good in regard to choices. And then helping them to self-assess the situation and identify if there is a problem. And again, that's what I talked about earlier, with simply stopping and identifying the problem is the first step in problem solving, right? Knowing the problem and being able to name it helps you then be able to move forward and solve the issue. And learning how to do it takes practice, it takes direct instruction, it takes real life situations. So again, modeling is huge in regard to this. If you have students in your class that are on the autism spectrum, in particular, if they're high functioning, they are of particular risk. So we know that students who have high functioning autism have an interest in social interactions, but oftentimes they lack the necessary skills to succeed in those arenas. So because they end up with poor social relationships and they're able to recognize that that's the case, they often suffer from loneliness. They have a lot of added stress. They have a negative affect, and sometimes even, suffer from depression. That's a very commonly co-occurring thing for people with high functioning autism. And so we want to be particularly aware of that group and, have supports available for them if we can. Have that open door policy if you're a teacher, building trust with that student. Having volunteer peer buddies can be helpful. Encouraging participation in organizations where they can succeed will be helpful. Including bullying and harassment awareness also can be key. And then, if they have an IEP, making sure that it contains social skills groups and making sure they have an opportunity to transfer those skills learned in the group into real life. As far as how schools can prevent suicide, this is a more sort of broad reaching thing, but of course you can educate your students about mental health conditions as you saw the video that we can provide and the curriculum that comes along with that we can share with you. Educating parents is huge. It starts at home, of course, but whether we teach the parents first or we teach the kids first, and they go home and teach their parents, getting those parents on board is very important. And then just creating a safe space for youth who are seeking help for themselves or for their friends, as you saw in the video example there. And as Alicia said, that video has been shown to be very helpful in at least getting students to seek out help for their friends. We provided some information on resolve crisis. Again, you want to always follow your school policy in regard to when you have students who you feel are in crisis or that you feel are suicidal, but these are the numbers that allow you to reach resolve. They have a variety of different services, but they will respond to your calls when you feel you have a child in crisis. It's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but we know that they are a very overworked system. We hope that just like schools are preparing for returning and preparing for the differences, that resolve will also be prepared, because I would imagine they will have an influx of calls to an elevated degree than they have in the past.
These are some of the different services that Resolve does offer. Again, if you're familiar with it, you'll know that they have a crisis team that can come out, and that's usually made up of 2 people. They have a walk-in center where anybody can go, even children, or I believe they have an adolescent unit, but can go in and say, you know what, I need to check myself in, I need a break. So they can stay there for, I think, 24 to 48 hours. And they're seen by a psychiatrist as well. And then, we also have a text line for resources for our students. We know that our students do not like speaking and they love to text. So this might be a good way to get students to start seeking some help. And, this text line has been really effective. When you call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, it takes you directly to our local resolve. So wherever you are in the nation, it takes you to that crisis center. So just so you guys are aware, if you give your students the resolve number and say, hey, if you need to talk to somebody, you can call this number, it will go to resolve. So for school districts and Moon, I'm sure you have this already done, but if you need assistance with implementing the suicide prevention policy into your own policies, we have information to help with that. Hopefully we will never have to share this with you, but we have an After the Suicide toolkit for schools, and it's excellent. It's very all-encompassing. I think it would be good for any type of tragedy, but specific to suicide, it's very good. And if there are people that want that, we can share that as well. So these are just some other programs that AFSP has. So they have Signs Matters, early detection, and these are a lot of pamphlets that they have or posters that can be put out. Again, here's the Suicide Prevention Lifeline.
I just want to mention about the Lifeline too, that it can tell your students that they can call for themselves or they can call for someone else. If they're worried about someone else, they can also call this number and talk with them about how to get their friend help.
Yeah, good point. So this brings us to almost the end. We are going to just kind of test your learning a little bit, and we will finish early. So if you all could log on to kahoot.it. I hope you guys are familiar with Kahoot. But
on a different device, Alicia, right?
Yeah, on a phone.
Yeah, on a different device, on a phone or something like that. If you have it. Also, one more call for names in the chat if you haven't already. I'm going to go ahead and save it. That's how we'll be tracking your attendance. So.
Uh-oh. Maybe we won't be playing it for virtual classroom.
Oh, there you got it. Well, the pin's coming. Someone's ahead of us. Yeah, so like I said, all the names that are going in the chat, if you haven't already put it in, if you did already, thank you. I'll give you guys some more time to do that. We will be filtering through that chat and putting it in, sending it to your administrators, and then we will also keep track of it. We're not really sure how the state is tracking this, but we do know they want you to have it every 5 years. So
it happens when stressful life events overload the coping abilities of someone suffering from a mental health condition.
So if you're still struggling how to do it, it says right there, join at kahoot.it.
An illness that goes
Kahoot, www.kahoot.it, and then type in this pin.
The research is clear. Suicide is preventable if we work together. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has set a bold goal to reduce the annual suicide rate 20% by 2025. We can save tens of thousands of lives, but we need the help of everyday heroes like you. People have suffered in silence for too long, and too many families have had to weather their losses alone. You can change that. We need you to be the voice for suicide prevention, and it can be as simple as reaching out to a friend, because talk saves lives. If you're having thoughts of suicide, or if you're concerned about someone else, assume you are the only one who will reach out. You can also join hundreds of thousands across the country for our Out of the Darkness community walks and raise awareness of suicide within your community. Together, We'll bring hope to those affected by suicide and raise awareness to save lives. Learn how you can fight suicide. Visit afsp.org today. If you've been affected by suicide, you're not alone. Suicide is a leading cause of death that affects millions each year. In most cases, it happens when stressful life events overload the coping abilities of someone suffering from a mental health condition. And the most common condition associated with suicide is depression, an illness that goes undiagnosed or untreated far too often. But the research is clear. Suicide is preventable if we work together.
We'll give you a couple more
The
minutes.
American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has set a bold goal to reduce the annual suicide rate 20% by 2025. We can save tens of thousands of lives, but we need the help of everyday heroes like you. People have suffered in silence for too long, and too many families have had to weather their losses.
We're losing people.
You can change that. We need you to be the
That's
voice
not
for
good.
suicide prevention, and it can be as simple as reaching out to a friend, because talk saves lives. If you're having thoughts of suicide, or if you're concerned about someone else, assume you are the only one who will reach out. You can also join hundreds of thousands across the globe for our Out of the Darkness community walks and raise awareness of suicide
Okay.
within your community.
Hopefully everybody's ready. We'll get started. So remember, the goal of this is to answer as quickly as you can. You get the most points. So suicide is a health issue. True or false? Yes or no? Okay, so yes, it is a health issue. We talked about that a lot. We want to move from the stigma of mental health as a choice to it is a health issue that needs to be treated and that we have no control over other than getting treatment. Okay, you guys can see the stats so far, pretty close. How can we prevent suicide? Tell people to get over it, become an expert in suicide prevention, learn about the warning signs and risk factors, go back to school. Yes, that is correct. If you did learning about the warning signs and risk factors, hopefully that you guys got that today and you do feel more comfortable understanding and knowing the risk factors and the warning signs that we discussed today. Michael has taken the lead. How many people worldwide die by suicide? We did not discuss this, but take your best guess.
I think they said it in the video at the beginning while people were putting their names in.
Yeah, they did.
It's a little rough. Expect you to listen to that.
Okay, 800,000 people a year. And you guys all had pretty good guesses, but 800,000 people a year die by suicide each year. Morgan is up. Someone dies by suicide every 40 seconds. True or false? True. Unfortunately, yes. Every 40 seconds, somebody dies by suicide, and that's throughout the world. That is not just in the United States. The United States, I believe it's very different. It might be like every 2 minutes or 5 minutes, but I don't have the exact amount of time. Anybody's game. Each suicide leaves behind an average of how many people? So this is that ripple effect that we talked about. So 115 people, when they, on average, when we look at the ripple of one person, let's say one student that dies, all the teachers that they knew, all the friends they knew, their family, their family's friends, you know, when we look at how far that spreads, it's on average 115 people. Nice job. Why do people take their own lives? There's usually one main reason: they lost their job. There are multiple factors that can put someone at risk. A breakup. So blue, yes, there are multiple factors. We talked about all those risk factors that can put somebody at risk. You know, whether there's a mental health condition, whether there is a psychological, biological, or past history. Those are all some of those risk factors that we talked about. Oh, TS is staying up there. Blank % of people who die by suicide have a mental health condition. So 90% of people, or 9 out of 10 people who die by suicide, do have a mental health condition. And we did discuss that earlier. Good job. TS was paying attention. The perspective of a suicidal person includes: their crisis point has been reached, thinking becomes limited, desperate to escape unbearable pain, all of the above. Excellent. Yes, it's all of the above. Basically, we talked about this. People, it could be the straw that broke the camel's back. They're not thinking clearly. They're not thinking and able to see the whole picture. And a lot of time that psychological pain is just as painful, if not more painful, than a physical pain can be. Okay, good job. The underlying risk factors of suicide include bullying, social skills, dating history, none of the above. None of the above. So yes, bullying is not one of those underlying risk factors. They're one of the external risk factors that we see, you know, that's more in the forefront rather than underlying. But none of those, each one is part of a risk factor, but not the underlying. Ray has taken the lead. What health factors 9 out of 10 times contribute to suicide risks? Excellent. Yes, correct. It is depression. We really want to hit home that it is a health disorder and it is the highest, you know, one of the highest contributors to suicide risks. So very good job. Good job, Ray. Environmental factors include the circumstances in a person's life, such as access to lethal means, prolonged stress, contagion, all of the above. Yes, all of the above. All three contribute or environmental factors that we discussed earlier. Ray is still in the lead. Historical factors are not a risk factor. True or false? Correct, false. Historical factors are a risk factor. We want to look at people's history, traumas that they've been through, and look at those as definitely as risk factors. Ray is hanging in there. TJ, we don't even know where you went. When someone completes suicide, it's usually because of bullying, a breakup, failing a test, underlying risk factors, or they are weak. Correct. It is underlying risk factors, as in health, history, and environment. Good job. Okay, about 5 more questions left. How can we prevent suicide? Hoping for the best, strengthen protective factors, praying, ignore it. I really hope everyone gets this. Wow. Come on, 1, 3, and 4. Hoping for the best. No, we want to strengthen those protective factors. We typically have done a lot of these trainings for the Catholic schools, and so we added that praying in for them. Okay. Our culture always supports and encourages seeking out mental health treatment. True or false? Correct, that is false. Typically, that in the past, it hasn't been. I think that we are hopefully seeing our culture move towards encouraging seeking out mental health treatment. And we hope that that will just continue to grow and strengthen for our culture and our students and us as well. Ray is holding strong. Suicide warning signs include talking about suicide, a significant change in a person's mood, engaging in drugs and alcohol, all of the above. Excellent. Yes, it is all of the above. And we talked about all of these 3 warning signs throughout our presentation today. Joe, you still got a chance. How can I help someone I believe is at risk? Ignore their behaviors. They're trying to get attention. Try and therapize them yourself. Talk, listen, express concern, refer to a professional. Excellent. I love that 2 people are going to try and therapize them. We're going to ask you not to, and talk, listen, and express concern. Refer them to a professional.
Maybe
Good
they're like
job.
maybe they are counselors or.
Oh, that's true. Although I don't think Kristen is on there, but there are school counselors, right?
Psychologists and counselors and right.
Okay, good job. If you think someone is actively suicidal, you should leave them alone to think, put them on a bus for the parents to deal with, tell them where they could buy a gun, absolutely none of the above. Wow, we have some jokesters here because I really hope those are jokes. Yes, absolutely none of the above. Do we want any of you to do any of those other things?
Someone in the chat says, I swear it was a mistake. Like it.
Thank you for letting us know that. We appreciate it. All right, let's see where we ended up. Good job, Mark, 3rd place. Joe? Wow, great job, Ray. We really appreciate you guys, taking the time to play our little game. How do I stop it? So we said we would finish up early. Jamie and I both tend to talk pretty fast, but we do want to give you an opportunity to let us know if you have questions. If there are things we didn't discuss, please ask, because we want you to leave here feeling like you have all the information you need to start the school year. So please feel free to either, unmute yourself, or if you'd like to talk, or put it into the chat.
Also, just one more time, I got a lot of responses last time I said about putting your name in the chat. So I'd assumed everyone had already been in at that point. So one more time, if you haven't put your name in, we're going to save it and turn it in. So. Thank you, Lisa. We try. I know it's a rough topic for the first couple of days of school when you're just getting back in the swing. It's certainly not a pleasant thing to talk about. But like I said, we think it's very important. So we hope that you learn something.
And if throughout the school year you want to, you have issues or you want to get in contact with us, Mr. Haslett has our contact information. So does Marissa. So does Marissa DeLille and Kristen King.
Oh. You're freezing, Alicia.
Oh.
So say again about Kristen King.
Oh, she has our contact information as well as Marissa DeLille.
Yeah, and the administrators who reached out to us for this too. So hi, Marissa.
Yeah, we miss you too, Marissa.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, then like I said, I'm going to give you a few more minutes to get your names in there, and you guys can go ahead and log off and enjoy the rest of your Friday and come back refreshed on Monday. And I hope you all have a good school year, and reach out if you have any questions.
Yeah, have a great school year, everyone. Jamie, are you going to stay on?
I am, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Thanks for everything.
Thank you.
You guys were a great audience.
Thank you. Real quick question while everybody's signing off. Do we have those individual flyers been sent to anybody that we could copy and post one in our classrooms for help for individual kids that may or may not seek immediate help, but may see that it might help?
We have not done that. If you reached out to AFSP, I know that they will send out information.
You may be able to just print them from their website even.
Yeah, that's true.
AFSP?
Correct.
Yep. American
.org.
Foundation for Suicide Prevention. It's afsp.org.
Awesome.
Good idea.
Yeah, I actually, any other time we've gotten programs, I've actually posted some stuff. So,
Great.
just in my classroom, because you always have those kids that are quiet that unfortunately we could miss behaviorally. So,
Especially I
all
think
right.
with the new text line, I think that's really something it's so easy to use.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. And like I said, for the most part, I'm decent at picking up kids. I think we all are to some degree, but no matter how good, when you have 125 kids, especially quiet ones, they can fly under the radar
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
pretty easily. So thanks, guys. You guys were great.
You're welcome.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Have a great year.
You
You
too.
too. Let us know if you need anything.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Is that your cat?
First my oven, now my cat. At least he was quiet while I was talking.
Just a reminder, people can end the meeting now. All right, well, let's save the chat.
Just did it. We both saved it, right?
I just did it.
Okay.
And I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay.